Hearing. A reminder that standing orders apply, particularly Standing Order 109, manner and form of questions. Treasurer, I invite you to introduce the officials accompanying you.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And this morning I have here with me Tim McManus, the Under-Treasurer, the Deputy Under-Treasurer, Mr Mick Butler, and Executive Directors, Ms Tiziana Hucent, Tarrant Moore and Jason Robertson.
Treasurer, I'll invite you to make a brief opening statement. I will then call for the questions relating to the statement. The committee will then consider any whole of government budget and fiscal strategy related questions before moving on to output specific questions. I'll invite the Shadow Minister to ask their questions first, followed by committee members. Finally, other participating members may ask questions. Other members may join in on a line of questioning pursued by a Shadow Minister rather than waiting for the end of the Shadow's questioning on the output. Treasurer, do you wish to make an opening statement regarding the Department of Treasury and Finance?
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you to all the committee members here today. And I will take the opportunity to make an opening statement in relation to my responsibilities as the Treasurer. And along with the officials that I have here with me this morning, we also have other officers as well who we may invite to the table at an appropriate time, if required, to provide information to the committee. And Mr Chair, as Treasurer, I will address the financial and economic matters related to the 2025 budget, including financial statements and fiscal strategy, territory revenue and the territory economy. I will also provide details on specific agency budgetary matters, including infrastructure projects, and they can be addressed by ministers responsible for those portfolios should that be required. And I would say to the committee that any questions relating to infrastructure be again put forward to me later on today. And as Shareholding Minister, I can address budgetary questions relating to the Parham Water Corporation, Territory Generation and 𝙍𝙀𝙇𝙀𝙑𝘍𝑒 Energy. Operational and other policy questions should be discussed at the Governing Corporations hearing later next week. In addition to whole-of-government financial issues, I will answer questions relating to the Department of Treasury and Finance as an agency, the Central Holding Authority and the Northern Territory Treasury Corporation. Furthermore, I will answer any questions in consideration to the Appropriations 2025-2026 Bill of 2025 and related revenue bills. Mr Chair, the 2025 budget restores confidence and rebuilds the Territory. It puts crime victims first, prioritises law and order and begins the long task of repairing Labor's mess. As part of our year of action, certainty and security, we launched our Rebuilding the Economy Northern Territory Economic Strategy 2025 to 2028 and are already delivering results. Gross state product is forecast to surge by 7.8% in 2025-2026, followed by a further 5.9% in 2026-2027. The unemployment rate is forecast to be 5% in 2025-2026 and steadily fall to 4.5% by the end of the forward estimates. Currently, inflation is the second lowest in the country and is expected to remain around 2.5% across the forward estimates. And recent data is also promising. Residential building approvals are the second strongest growing in the nation. Inflation-adjusted household spending in the Territory rose by 1.6% in the March quarter of 2025 and by 4.8% over the year, reaching $2.3 billion. That's the strongest result of any jurisdiction across both periods. Independent economic forecasts, as at the March quarter 2025, show there is up to $9.3 billion worth of projects under construction in the Northern Territory, with a further $680 million committed and a total project pipeline of $12.9 billion. Private sector confidence is back, and we are working side by side with businesses through our industry-focused agencies and the Territory Coordinator through tax relief, land release and streamlined approvals to develop the Territory's economy. On the fiscal side, we inherited deep deficits and mounting debt from Labor. Importantly, we also inherited a string of unfunded frontline services and programs. with funding of up to $350 million per year scheduled to cease across the budget and forward estimates. To fill that gap and stay under Labor's so-called debt ceiling, we would have had to deliver deep, damaging cuts worth around $1.4 billion over the period. Territorians need to know that Labor budgeted for severe funding cuts to frontline services in health, courts, corrections, youth justice and domestic family and sexual violence over the forward estimates period in its 2024 budget. Territorians also need to know that Labor shamefully announced a record number of infrastructure projects but didn't provide enough cash to deliver on many of them. Despite these record announcements, Labor actually budgeted to reduce capital works cash allocations, again only providing time-limited funding with a reduction of $250 million planned for 25-26 in Labor's final 2024 budget. But we've chosen a more responsible path. We've stabilised Labor's reckless budget without resorting to austerity and without putting the Territory's economy at risk. We will not punish Territorians for Labor's failures. While we've removed Labor's arbitrary debt ceiling, the public sector will not have a licence to spend money. Agencies have been directed to find $20 million per year across government in operational savings, focused on reducing consultancies, travel, communications and marketing and other discretionary spending. In place of Labor's debt ceiling, the CLP government has introduced a budget repair strategy to address the fiscal position and challenges that we've inherited, and it comprises of 5 key priorities: growing our own source revenue through economic development and population growth, containing employee cost growth and focusing on resources to the front line, engaging with the Commonwealth to unlock economic opportunities, enable sustainable debt management and support regional and remote Territorians, and strengthening policies and processes across government to improve effectiveness and government spending, and finally implementing a new, contemporary and simplified fiscal strategy focused on realistic and achievable debt management. As part of this budget, we have introduced legislative amendments to the Gaming Control Act of 1993, establishing a 50% tax rate on profits from lottery ticket reselling and matching activities under internet gaming agreements. This will standardise the taxation of internet gaming in the Territory and ensure a level playing field for online operators who offer ticket reselling or matched lottery products. We're also amending the Racing and Wagering Act of 2024 to double the annual tax cap for bookmakers and betting exchanges from 1 million to 2 million revenue units starting on the 1st of July 2025. I will close out my opening statement, Mr Chair, and I'm happy to take questions from the committee.
Thank you, Treasurer. Are there any questions on the statement? Leader of the Opposition.
How did you know? Good morning, Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Treasurer, and thank you, Treasury Department. Treasurer, your government's so-called major review of the infrastructure program resulted in a brutal $1.1 billion cut from the 2024-25 published program. Let's be clear, that's $1 billion ripped out of job-creating, economy-boosting infrastructure. Treasurer, what exactly is your criteria in the cuts that you have made around the infrastructure program? Did you go suburb by suburb, or did you just slash whatever Labor did and committed to without thinking of the consequences to Territorians overall?
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. This is probably a question better asked of me this afternoon during infrastructure, but I'll answer what I can now. You mistakenly call it cuts to the infrastructure program. You can't cut something that was not funded and didn't have any cash allocation. The department went through the infrastructure program, which was your $5.2 billion infrastructure program, and a number of the projects were many, many years old, and of course the scoping and costings for those projects were no longer relevant. So the agency, the department, went through the entire program along with myself and looked at what was in the program, what could be delivered, what was now effectively out of scope. There was no going through by suburb or region by region. It was a very, very clinical assessment of the program to see what can be delivered. Now, we've pared that program back and made it effectively more realistic. So it's not cash that's been removed, Leader of the Opposition. We've actually cashed the infrastructure program higher than what you did. And I suppose I need to make very clear that your record infrastructure program that you'd put in place, you'd only cashed at just over $300 million for the next financial year should you have come back into government. That $300 million would have only funded a very small amount of programs, probably being the Mandurah Jetty, the art gallery next door here, and some remote housing projects. That would have then effectively utilised your entire $300 million budget. So we've come in and looked at the program that was in place, and we've had to fund the stuff that was already underway. There's things that we couldn't stop, and we wouldn't stop because they're there to serve as Territorians, which has required us to increase the cash allocation to your previous infrastructure budget. But the infrastructure budget now is actually more realistic. It's focused on things that can be delivered, not things that have been sitting on that program for so many years that the scope and costings are no longer relevant. And I think we could probably get an idea of that if we talk about, say, the 𝙍𝙀𝙇𝙬𝙎𝙎𝙎 overpass. Now, the previous government, the Labor government, used costings on that project, I believe, from the 1980s, and you only scoped that project at $65 million, yet when it went to market, it required over $160 million to complete. The art gallery next door here, scoped at $45 to $50 million. It's now actually going to cost over $145 million. I spoke about the Mandurah Jetty facilities. Again, you put that out to tender so many times with only a small allocation of cash, and it required double the amount. It's nearly up to $100 million to deliver that project. So there's some examples of why the program need to be revisited, because you can't just keep going out and putting out tenders for projects that are relying on scoping and costings that are maybe 8 years old. The marketplace has changed, Leader of the Opposition. What cost might have been 8 years ago is very, very different to what the cost is today. But your government still kept putting things out with old costings, and then those costs escalated, sometimes double or triple what the program and cash was available. So that's why that program has been revisited and looked at what we can deliver, what we can realistically deliver, and any of those projects that may have been on that program, should we choose to go and revisit those, they will need to be recosted. They will need to be rescoped, because the costings that you put up in that program from 8 years ago, when they've been sitting there for that long.
Treasurer, if you could refer to the Leader of the Opposition as either Leader of the Opposition or the former government or the former Labor government.
Okay.
ALP.
Thank you. So those costings, which are over 8 years old, are no longer relevant. So if we were to go and deliver those programs, then we will have to go back and rescope and recost them, because we need to put costings relevant to today's dollars in place, rather than putting out projects that have costings and scopings that are that old that they are no longer fit for purpose. So, and then from that, we need to do the cash allocation to support those programs. It's something that the former government didn't do. So I'm not going to continue doing what the former government did and just keep putting out tenders using old scoping and old costs, and then having those programs blow out in costs, and then, of course, causing issues for the budget. So it's something we won't do, and we'll continue to work on the infrastructure program and analyse what that is, and making sure that projects that we put out are scoped effectively, priced properly, so that we can deliver them on time and on budget, something that the previous government certainly failed to do.
Thank you, Treasurer. So your approach is to not go out and do the hard work and to rescope the costings, and to actually have the up-to-date costings for any infrastructure projects, and just to completely cut projects altogether. That's your approach, is it, Treasurer?
Leader of the Opposition, that's not what I said. I didn't say that we wouldn't do the work. I said the stuff that was on that, the projects on that infrastructure program, well, many of them were out of date. the costings and scopings were no longer relevant because they sat there and they're that old. And the program that you put in place, a $5.2 billion program with only, for this budget, your previous budget, of $300 million in cash. The project had to be rationalised. We need the department, and I think I've said it publicly many times, I've said it to the department, we need to be delivering 100 things very, very well rather than 1,000 things very, very badly. And your program that you put in place, it was so large and it was driven by, I suppose, press release, put the pressure on the department to get out and try and scope and cost all of these programs and put them under immense pressure. And from that, and from the push from the previous government to get these things out, you're pushing the department to get things out that were underscoped. So without the proper scoping, which then allowed the programs costings to effectively blow out. You push them to put stuff out without appropriate scoping. So that's changed. So we've pulled back the program. We're delivering on things that specifically matter for Territorians. We're going to look at
Territorians, though, Treasurer?
all Territorians, Leader of the Opposition.
Sounds like most of the projects you've cut.
Maybe you
through the
should direct your
infrastructure
questions through the Chair.
project. Mr.
Leader of the
Chair, it
Opposition.
sounds like the Treasurer has cut
Leader of the
most of the
Opposition,
infrastructure
Leader of the
program from the
Opposition,
bush.
Leader of the Opposition, thank you. I'm going to state, so to start with, I have two things. We'll remove all personal connotations in both questions and answers. Leader of the Opposition, your question had you're in it as well, please. It's Treasurer, current government or CLP government. And Treasurer, please also ensure we uphold that. Please let the Treasurer finish an answer before we come in with another one. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think I'd effectively answered the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Treasurer, when you were in opposition, you regularly attacked Labor over debt, warning about interest costs, future burdens and the need for fiscal discipline. You've now had your first crack at a budget, which includes a net debt projection of $13.5 billion by 2028, and that's $1 billion increase from the budget projection just 12 months ago under the former Labor government. Treasurer, you've also removed the debt ceiling and spent an extra $1 billion in your first budget. How do you explain your hypocrisy to Territorians?
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition, for the question. And I think that's fairly easy to answer. And I've spoken at length publicly and in Parliament, and I'll speak about it again here today, about the funding cliffs and the unfunded liabilities that we inherited from the Labor government. Now, when we came into government, I sat down with the Treasury officials and looked at the state of the books. And it was very, very clear that in the out years that there was going to be a breach of Labor's arbitrary debt ceiling. And what we found when we got down and had a very, very close look at the previous budget and what the forward estimates were going to look like was the unfunded liabilities that Labor left behind. Now, these unfunded liabilities, as I've said, were in health, corrections, mental health, aged care, family and children's services. These were programs that you knew were going to be ongoing over the next 4 or 5 years. But the previous government chose not to fund them beyond the 24 budget. Now, this was effectively done on purpose to show that the previous government and their budget was not going to breach their own arbitrary debt ceiling. Now, these were projects, I think it was $350 million a year that were effectively unfunded, and these are effectively frontline services to deliver to Territorians. These were not in your budget papers going forward from 2024. These were services required for Territorians. We made the conscious decision in this budget that we're not going to try and hide the numbers, hide the facts. These were things that needed to be delivered for Territorians. So we included those in the budget going forward because we needed to know what the real cost was going to be of delivering service for the people in the Northern Territory. In addition to that, we've seen an increase in spending because the previous government failed to invest into the justice system. For many, many years, it has been raised that if you invest into police, you need to invest in your other justice services, which was not done. So we've seen large investments into police over many, many years, but we've seen very little in the way of investment into corrections, courts, the justice system overall, including legal aid, community corrections, and those all-important services to help people who have come into contact with the justice system. They were also part of the funding cliffs or the unfunded liabilities from the former government. So we've been upfront and adamant about we will invest into social order, and this budget shows that, a $1.5 billion investment into the social order system to deal with crime and antisocial issues across the Territory. And $600 million of that, of course, to police, and the rest spread through corrections, courts, community corrections, and, of course, those treatment services that go along with it. So they are the things that have driven the debt for this budget. And they're things that we couldn't control, in effect. These were things left over from the previous government. I said those funding cliffs were huge, and if we had to stop those, if we had have done what Labor done and not budgeted for them and not delivered on them, then the effect on Territorians and those lack of services delivered would have been absolutely profound and would have sent the Territory and Territorians into a very, very difficult position and a downward spiral. So those programs had to be funded. Now, if Labor had won the election, they would have been in the same position that the CLP is here today. They would have had to either choose to not fund them, which I'm guaranteed they wouldn't have done. They would have had to fund those services and programs, and they would find their budget position very, very similar to ours. But the difference being is that they would have possibly only funded them for 1 year, and I suppose that's a little bit of supposition to show that their budget would have looked good into the outer years. But we've made the conscious decision, Mr. Chair.
The Chair is making assumptions. Can we, bring it back?
Yeah, all right, we'll bring it back to the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But we've made the conscious decision to fund those programs ongoing and show those in the budget papers. So we know what the actual cost is of delivering for Territorians. We know what the cost of those programs will be going forward. And that is what shows in the change in budget position from last year to this year. But what we certainly do see, Mr. Chair, is in the forward estimates of this budget, we start to see a return to surplus in the government sector. So it was a $730 million deficit. We've reduced that to, I think, $215 million, and we see that going from deficit to a surplus in the outer years of the forward estimates. And we also see a change in the financial public sector as well. So whilst that's high, we're seeing a change in that. I think we've reduced that to $1.3 billion in this budget, and we start to see that reduced to $530 million in the outer years of this budget. But it will take a long time to repair that, Mr. Chair. So we have a program in place to work on debt repair and, of course, efficiency in spending. I've outlined that in my opening statement as well.
Thank you, Chair. Treasurer, Moody's reviewed the Territory's credit rating in March 2025 and it remained unchanged on the 2024-25 mid-year report. However, on your own budget paper 2, which notes the following, and I quote, "Since this assessment, government has repealed the legislative debt ceiling and has approved significant new operating and capital commitments, increasing fiscal balance, deficits and debt levels in the 2025-26 budget." Treasurer, are you concerned that the credit rating will be further downgraded as our debt and interest payments continue to spiral? If so, what analysis have you done into the impact of a downgrading by Moody's? And if not, why haven't you done your work and given some genuine thought around this?
Yes, well, thank you for the question, Leader of the Opposition. And of course, Moody's will be assessing our debt rating, and that will take place, I believe, in their meeting at September this year. But I may hand over to the Under Treasurer, who has probably more information on this.
Thank you. Tim McManus, Under Treasurer. Yes, you're correct, Leader of the Opposition. Moody's will make an assessment on the 25-26 budget we met with them late last week, middle of last week, to provide them, I guess, an update on the budget position and the economic forecasts that underpin the 25-26 budget. And they will take that away, and they issue 6 monthly, committee assessments of the budget for all jurisdictions. And given their last one was in March, the next one due is in September this year. It's important to note that Moody's take into account a whole range of quantitative and qualitative factors into their credit rating assessment. It's not just based on the fiscal aggregates. A lot of the reason they came to visit in Darwin in person is to get a better understanding of the economic climate and the economic potential over the coming years. So they'll take all of that into account, along with liquidity ratios and a whole bunch of other accounting ratios in their assessment. And we expect to get a revised assessment in September this year.
Thank you, Under Treasurer. Through the Chair, Treasurer, are you avoiding accountability by your removal of the debt ceiling, and does this give your government now a free pass to borrow without limits?
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. Absolutely not. The arbitrary debt ceiling that was put in place by the previous government, there are a number of flaws with that debt ceiling. For instance, it wasn't matched with CPI, so it was an arbitrary cap. And what it did, and again, looking at the previous budget, it showed that ceiling was going to be breached in the outer years. And the previous government were doing everything they could leading into last year's election to show that they weren't going to have that breach and have to report on it, which would have been in last year's estimates. So whilst we've removed the debt ceiling, it certainly has not given us free rein to spend money. What it's allowed us to do is be a little bit more flexible in how we spend. And of course, we're going to have to borrow money and spend money to deliver for the Territory. So our fiscal strategy, specifically around growing our own source revenue, which will help to reduce that debt burden by increasing revenue for the Territory, by managing our public sector and making sure that we're focused on our frontline staffing and not seeing increases in the back end. Of course, creating that regulatory environment for private sector to come and invest, because we know that to grow the economy we also need private sector investment. It can't be all delivered by the government. And to do these things, it costs money, and we're still going to have to borrow to be able to deliver on those services for the Territory, because we've been put in a position from previous budgets where we've seen those increases, and the only way would have been to stop that breach of the debt ceiling, which, as what I've said, is that we would have had to find $1.4 billion in savings within the public sector. I think I've said this publicly a number of times. To do that would have required the sacking of 4,000 public servants to stay under that $1.4 billion cost that was in the budget. We're not going to do that, Leader of the Opposition. We've said we wouldn't do that, and we won't do that, because if we were to cut $1.4 billion out of the economy to try and stay under the previous government's arbitrary debt ceiling, it would be absolutely detrimental to the Northern Territory and would send our economy into freefall. By trying to remove that many public servants would be absolutely catastrophic, because it would kill our economy, and we won't do that. We need our public sector working with us to help us grow the economy. So we're not going to go down severe austerity measures to try and remove that $1.4 billion, which would have been to try and stay under the previous government's arbitrary debt cap. We're working through other methods to maintain and reduce our spending, but also then to work on our budget repair strategy to reduce that debt. But that is going to take some time, Leader of the Opposition. It's not something that we can do overnight. I'll throw to the Under Treasurer, who has some more detail on that as well.
Thank you, Treasurer. Yes, it's important to note that at the time of the 24-25 budget under the Labor government, projections to breach the debt ceiling, we're expecting to breach the debt ceiling by around 28,930. Through the PFO, based on the PFO numbers, if we were to add it back in the time-limited funding that was dropping away, the adjusted timeline for breaching the debt ceiling would have been 26-27. And similarly, under the 25-26 budget, if the debt ceiling had not been repealed, we would have also been forecast to breach debt ceiling in 26-27. So it would have required some significant savings in order to avoid that.
Thank you. And through the Chair, Treasurer, have you replaced the debt ceiling accountability and measures with anything else to hold yourself and your government accountable when it comes to the Northern Territory's economy?
Yes, thank you for the question, Leader of the Opposition. And we did release our fiscal strategy and budget repair as required in the Fiscal Integrity and Transparency Act of 2021. And of course, this is based on principles of sound fiscal management. So our strategy and objectives and targets within the new fiscal strategy was simplified from the 15 of the previous government to 6 fiscal objectives that are focused on debt management and, of course, debt reduction. And our fiscal targets represent what is needed to return to a financially sustainable position and take into consideration the current fiscal and economic conditions that we face. And, of course, we measure those against other jurisdictions on their performance and our performance. So on 31 January 25, Cabinet endorsed the replacement of the legislated debt ceiling with a broader repair strategy. And of course, there's 5 repair strategy components, and those 5 priorities, of course, are growing our own source revenue through economic development and population growth, which I've spoken previously about, constraining employee cost growth by restraining growth in non-frontline staffing, engaging, of course, with the Commonwealth to unlock economic opportunities for the Territory to enable sustainable debt management and support our regional and remote areas, strengthening our policies and processes across government to effectively improve the effectiveness of government spending, and developing a new contemporary and simplified fiscal strategy focused on prudent debt management. And the Cabinet replaced the efficiency dividend, of course, with a budget repair measure directed for agencies, which I spoke about in my opening statement, which is now $20 million per annum across whole of government. So rather than go down the road of efficiency dividends, each agency now is required to have input into that $20 million per annum efficiency and savings across whole of government. So I hope that answers your question, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. And through the Chair, Treasurer, how can you justify forcing every department to find that $20 million in austerity measures while your decisions in your first budget have resulted in total government debt growing by $1 billion?
Leader of the Opposition is a change from what was previously the efficiency dividend, which was levied across all departments arbitrarily, which was a specific percentage. Now, with that change, it's focused more on how departments manage within and where they can find savings measures through different areas. So each department is responsible for providing savings up to that $20 million, and the CEs of those agencies will be responsible for working with their agencies to deliver on that. I can flick to the Under Treasurer, who has some more detail.
Thank you, Treasurer, and thank you, Leader of the Opposition. The savings target, there are actually 2 savings targets and budget repair measures within the budget. There was a $20 million that was factored into the mid-year report for all agencies to identify $25 million with a focus on operational efficiencies, consultancies and travel expenses. And then there's also the efficiency dividend, which has been in the budget and is, I guess, a measure that used by all governments over the course of time to constrain growth and expenditure, has just been relabelled as a budget repair measure. Agencies, those savings measures and budget repair measures are factored into each agency's budget on the basis of, well, BP3 provides a basis of how they're factored in. Some agencies get a discount on that budget repair measure. of a third for those frontline agencies in recognition of the limited capacity that they have to reduce staffing costs. Each agency has assigned their target and they're working through their CE with their minister to remain within their overall budget and achieve that target.
Thank you. And through the chair, according to Treasury's economic and fiscal update released in February this year, population growth will be central to your government's budget repair strategy, which is spoken about already this morning. Yet your budget economic outlook has population outlook remaining steady over the forward estimates at 1.2%. Will you be honest, Treasurer, and admit you don't actually have a population growth strategy?
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. I'll probably disagree with your statement there. We certainly do have a population growth strategy, but we're actually quite realistic about the numbers that we're projecting in our budget papers. I do remember being here last year questioning the previous Treasurer over
Through the
population
chair,
growth.
can we stop with the long story narratives and just get to the answer from the Treasurer? I'm actually really interested in the figures here, so I'd love to hear a story around your population growth strategy, Treasurer.
Okay. Let the Treasurer speak. I would suggest if we take out the personal aspects in the question, so again, I'll bring it back to removing you and please replace with the government. And then we can just go straight into questions and answers. Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as I was saying, I sat here last year and questioned the previous government on the 3% figure they had for population growth, which was not supported by any strategies whatsoever. Now, what we have done, and other ministers, particularly Minister Carl has done, is work with the federal government to change the details of the 𝙍𝙬𝙉𝙍 agreement. So we actually now have an increase in the ability to get people to the territory under the 𝙍𝙬𝙉𝙍, which will underpin some of that population growth as well. Now, the figures that we have in our budget paper are actually realistic. And they're certainly achievable and on par with other jurisdictions on percentages. The other thing, of course, that we are doing, if you look at our Fresh Start and homegrown grants and strategies, is using those to attract people here to the territory or get people to actually stay here in the territory by having the opportunity to build a house and put down roots here and stay here. The Fresh Start grants are specific, the $30,000 grants are specifically targeted at those people in the state who might want to move the territory and build a house and call the territory home. So, yes, we do have a strategy, Leader of the Opposition. The figures that we have in our budget are realistic. If we exceed those, I'll be very, very happy, and we certainly will be working to exceed those. And the opportunities that we've been provided within the 𝙍𝙬𝙉𝙍 certainly help, and we continue to work with the federal government on interstate migration and overseas migration towards and focus towards the Northern Territory to assist us in growing our population base here.
Thank you. And through the chair, Treasurer, your government is running larger deficits than what the former Labor government did, whilst also claiming to be fixing the books. Treasurer, how much will the Territory pay in interest repayments on this growing debt over the forward estimates, and how does that compare to the cost of core services like health and education, which you mentioned earlier?
Thank you. Yeah, the second page. And I'll open in the response by going back to, as said, those unfunded liabilities which sat in the previous budget, which we've then funded to deliver those services for Territorians, which sees that larger fiscal deficit than we had before. But interest expenses are projected to be $679 million in 2025-26, increasing to 911 by 28-29. Interest expenses per day are expected to be 1.86 million in 2025-26, increasing to $2.5 million by 28-29.
Thank you, Treasurer. And through the chair, you've made many public commitments about there would be no austerity measures in your budget. Treasurer, can you please confirm, have you asked every agency to find that $20 million saving, which could also be called austerity measures?
Effectively, Leader of the Opposition, they are efficiencies. It's certainly not what you would call austerity. I'm not trying to cut $1.4 billion out of the public sector over 4 years. This government has asked all agencies to find efficiencies of $20 million across the public sector per annum, which is somewhat in line with the previous efficiency dividends, but it allows the agencies, I think, more flexibility to find how they make those savings and make those efficiencies within, rather than just pulling it straight out of the bottom line of their budgets.
Thank you, Treasurer. And would that include staff cuts in each agency should they choose to go that direction?
Leader of the Opposition, it doesn't include staffing cuts. We've been open about how they can find their efficiencies. There are ways to do it within consultancies, advertising, and of course other methods within their agencies to reduce some costs and be probably more efficient.
Thank you. And Treasurer, can you please detail what each agency has offered up to achieve their $20 million of saving? And if so, could you table that?
Thank you. I can't exactly provide that detail, Leader of the Opposition, because that would be the responsibility of each minister and each CEO. But safe to say that ministers are working with the CEOs and CEOs are working with these agencies to find what is required of their agencies to contribute towards that overall $20 million of savings.
Thank you. Well then, Treasurer, would you be able to detail what your Department of Treasury and Finance is offering up as a $20 million cut to their budget?
Thank you. I'll hand to the Under Treasurer, who will be able to answer that.
Thank you. The Department of Treasury and Finance had a savings target of $152,000 per annum. We'll be focusing on reducing our use of external consultancies, travel and other operational efficiencies to be able to manage that.
Thank you, Under Treasurer. And through the Chair, I'll continue some questions on the opening statement. Treasurer, how much public money has been spent to date on advertising and promoting the 2025 Northern Territory budget, and can you provide a breakdown, please?
Just bear with us, Leader of the Opposition, while we find that cost for you. Thank you. I'll pass to the Under Treasurer to provide the detail.
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. So the media campaign for the 25-26 budget was $47,512. Budget book production was $34,683 and budget banners was $935. Total of $83,130.
Thank you, Under Treasurer. And Treasurer, how many public or stakeholder events did you host or attend as part of your budget roadshow?
Leader of the Opposition, I think that was 7. There was 3 in Darwin, Katherine, Tennant Creek, Alice Springs, 2 in Alice Springs. 1 in Alice Springs and 1 in Nullarbor, so 7.
Thank you, Treasurer. And do you have a breakdown of how many members of the community attended each of those events, excluding public servants?
No, we don't have that detail, Leader of the Opposition.
Would you be able to take that question on notice, Treasurer?
I don't think I can, Leader of the Opposition. I don't think we recorded that data. No, I can't provide any detail on that.
And some of them were.
Yeah, and also, I suppose, Leader of the Opposition, some of those events were hosted by industry, and of course, I don't have access to their data and who attended for those industry forums.
Thank you, Treasurer. Could you give us an idea of your regional road shows? I'm assuming they were hosted by government. So for Catherine, did you do one in Tennant Creek? I missed to hear if you said Tennant.
Yes, Leader of the Opposition, we did. We hosted an event in Tennant Creek. I believe it was on a Wednesday evening at Battery Hill. Catherine was in Godalming Centre. Alice Springs was co-hosted by the Chamber of Commerce and
Chamber
of Commerce and building Master Builders, and Nhulunbuy was just hosted by Northern Territory Government.
Thank you. And the cost that the Under Treasurer provided earlier, Treasurer, around the promotion, that would that include the cost for the road shows?
I'll pass down the Treasurer to provide that detail.
No, some of the budget book production and banners were used at the roadshow, so the budget overviews were handed out as at the roadshow, and the banners were there standing behind as the Treasurer presented. No, the media campaign, the roadshows were, invites were managed separately, and like the Treasurer said, some of them were through peak organisations who managed the invitation list, so they weren't included in the media campaign.
Thank you. And in the case of the Catherine Budget Presentation Roadshow, do you have an update can you provide an update to the committee around how much that roadshow cost to put on?
Again, I'll ask the Under Treasurer to provide detail on that.
Thank you.
I don't have the by region, but the total of 3 locations that were hosted by government, venue hire and catering, was $2,976.
Thank you. And just confirming that you didn't keep a list of who attended any of those roadshows.
No, there was I guess there were invitations sent out to a wide range of stakeholders and interested parties, but we didn't have a list ticking people off as they came in. And some of the events were, I guess, managed and coordinated by industry bodies, so not from us.
Okay, thank you. And just as an example, Catherine, how many people would you have had attend the budget roadshow there?
I think Catherine, it may have been 10 to 12 people, if I remember correctly. The attendance at Catherine certainly, unfortunately, wasn't what we would have expected. Our first budget presentation there earlier this year was well attended. Unfortunately, we didn't see the attendance rates we would have liked to at Catherine.
Thank you. And Treasurer, what's the actual stated objective or outcome of these roadshows?
Or what we were achieving with the roadshows is getting out into the regions and providing to the people in those communities an overview of what the budget was, and that was the Under Treasurer's job to talk about the high level numbers and what the budget looked like for the territory, as well as the regional components of our budget. So a lot of that focused around infrastructure and spending within those regions, and giving the people in the regions the opportunity to ask questions of us. It's not everybody can make it to Darwin, and not everyone can make it to those events that happen here where there are large numbers of people. So it's the opportunity to get out into the regions, talk to people there, listen to what they have to say, and answer what we can for the people out in our communities. Previously, these weren't happening. The budget was presented and delivered here in Darwin. There wasn't that much industry participation on those budget days, and we've gone back to that to be able to provide what information we can out to the regions.
Sorry, Treasurer, did I understand you correctly saying that there were no regional budget roadshows in the former Labor government? Is that what you're insinuating?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there was probably a lack of consultation out in the regions, or a lack of, I suppose, presentation out in the regions. I certainly understand that the industry, I suppose, lunches and breakfasts here in Darwin fell away, and it was just one presentation after the budget was delivered down at the waterfront. So we've made that commitment to engage with industry and business and communities to give them the opportunity to ask questions directly of myself as the Treasurer, and also of the Under-Treasurer directly, which it's good to be able to give that opportunity to people in the region, something that has certainly been lacking.
Just to confirm through the chair that yes, there were regional budget roadshows. You may not have ever bothered to attend them, but they were delivered under former Labor government. Treasurer, are you willing to provide the committee with a breakdown of each of the events that were hosted and organised by the Northern Territory government when it came to the budget roadshows? Noting you've already said some were industry supported and arranged, but in terms of the NTG organised and paid for, including venue hire, audio-vision, event management support, catering, travel, accommodation for the Treasurer and any department staff.
Leader of Opposition, we're happy to provide that detail. We can't provide it now, but we're happy to take that question on notice.
Thank you.
Leader of the Opposition, please restate the question for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Treasurer, are you willing to provide the committee with a breakdown of the total cost of delivering the budget roadshows in 2025 that were delivered by the Northern Territory government, including venue hire, audio-vision, event management support, catering, travel and accommodation to the Treasurer and any department staff?
Yes, we can.
Treasurer, do you accept the question?
Yes, I do.
The question asked by the Leader of the Opposition of the Treasurer has been allocated the number 2.1. Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Treasurer, has the government collected feedback and measured the effectiveness of the first CLP government roadshows? And if not, will you do so?
Not at this stage, Leader of the Opposition. I said that only happened last week, and then we're here or the week before last, sorry, then we're here for estimates. So I know that we received feedback and we took questions, and I know that we did endeavour to get back to a number of people on some of the questions that were asked. So we have in that respect.
Thank you, Treasurer. What measures are in place to ensure budget advertising and roadshow messaging is informational and not political in nature?
Well, I suppose when we look at the road shows and the way that they are structured is that there are two parts. The Under-Treasurer gives overall an overview of the total budget, and then I myself gave an overview from a government perspective and on a regional perspective of what we were spending in those regions. So I know I spoke specifically in Katherine about the Big Rivers region. I spoke in Barkly about what was happening in the Barkly region as far as investment, and the same for Central Australia and the same for Nhulunbuy. So I don't know exactly what the premise of your question is, Leader of the Opposition, but we were there providing information to those regions from a government perspective and from a CLP government perspective in respect to what the CLP government was delivering into those regions.
Thank you, Treasurer. I appreciate your answer. Treasurer, when you went fishing the week before the budget was handed down, why did you not formally declare leave or appoint an acting Treasurer as standard practice when a minister is unavailable for their normal duties?
Leader of the Opposition, if you could re-ask that question, removing the conduct. Yeah, if you just say, if you could ask about leave, maybe not what the minister. Yeah.
Mr. Chair, the Treasurer can answer, I'm sure, if he would like to answer. And why did he not take leave on the week before when he was out enjoying the Territory lifestyle and not doing his job as the Treasurer before the first CLP budget was delivered?
An interesting question, Mr. Chair, and I'll provide an answer to the Leader of the Opposition. I was doing my job as the Treasurer. I never not do my job as the Treasurer. And I think as the Leader of the Opposition would understand, when they were a former minister in government, represent a remote electorate, you can still do your job and not be in your office. I'm a bush member.
How is being the treasurer and out fishing and
trying to-
marshalling
I'm-
for a fishing classic your job as
Okay.
treasurer?
Committee. Treasurer has the floor.
Thank you.
He has the vote.
And as a remote member, I'm able to do my duties as a minister and be out of my electorate at the same time. So
I
whilst,
didn't know that the Daily was your electorate treasurer.
Leader of the Opposition, Treasurer has the floor.
I'm getting very tired of this line of questioning and the interjections from the Leader of the
Why
Opposition.
didn't you take leave,
whilst I'm
treasurer?
trying
That's
to
standard
answer the
practice
question.
if you're not
Leader of
doing
the
your duty
Opposition,
as a minister.
Leader of
Why
the
did you not take
Opposition.
leave?
Leader of the Opposition. Okay. I'll refer everyone to Standing Order 109, just being critical of character, and that we are not to ask questions critical of character. I accept the question, Leader of the Opposition. The Treasurer will be heard in silence. Any more interjections will lead to a warning. Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And as I was saying, I represent a remote electorate and I spend time in my electorate and I'm still able to fulfil my duties as a minister whilst I'm not in the office. So in the week leading into the budget, I was not in my office. I was volunteering for a community organisation in an event that actually brings in considerable income to the Northern Territory, and I'm a proud volunteer of that event and have been for 13 years. So whilst I was volunteering, I was also able to continue my duties as the Treasurer, thankful to technology. So I was able to be out of the office, volunteering and helping a community-based organisation, an event that brought significant income to the Territory and to the Daly River region, and I was still able to perform my duties as the Treasurer because I was in constant contact with my office via either phone or via data and emails, and I consistently worked with my agency and with my office on the delivery of the budget. Now, if the Leader of the Opposition thinks that the budget is developed and delivered in the last week before the budget, the Leader of the Opposition is, I think, probably misinformed. As a member of the former government and probably as a member of Budget Cabinet, the Leader of the Opposition would know very, very well that the budget is developed way ahead of the actual delivery date in Parliament in May. So I was able to do my duties whilst I was volunteering for another organisation, very similarly to what the opposition leader would have done when a minister in the former government went out bush. So I think the question is a bit of a moot point.
Can I ask what was the biggest barrier you caught there?
Treasurer, as funny as the question is, we won't be going into that.
Goes to the economic value of the fishing classics, which the treasurer just spoke about.
I can inform the committee that during the event for the Barra Classic, I think there was 684 barramundi caught for the week, and they were tagged and released. And of course, that event then, that tag and release procedure, then assists fisheries in tracking fish, looking at fish stocks, development, movement and growth rates. So not only does that event drive economic benefit for the Northern Territory in a very, very large way, but it also then works with fisheries in measuring barramundi growth, movement across the board. So,
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And through the chair, Treasurer, while you were out on the boat, can you confirm who was making the financial decisions on behalf of the Northern Territory in your absence?
That's very easy to answer, Mr Chair. I was making the financial decisions for the Northern Territory as the Treasurer.
Through the chair. Treasurer, when did the budget go to print? The exact date, please. And what was the last possible date to make changes to it?
I'll hand to the Under-Treasurer to provide detail on that.
The budget papers go to print at various timeframes throughout the budget production process. The last paper that went to print was the speech, which went on Sunday morning, I believe. But other books, including the economy, budget paper number 2, 3, 4, went to the printer the prior week. I think the first one went Wednesday, the week prior to the budget. In terms of the final cut-off for making decisions into the budget, I think we put the disclosure in BP2. I don't have a BP2 on me. Here we go. Which was the 7th of May. But as you know, the usual process is that there's no further cabinet decisions that affect or impact the financial statements made a few weeks prior to that to enable time to run consolidated financial reports and ensure that the figures in the budget are all correct and consistent across all books.
Just for the committee, we'll now break for 5 minutes. Time now is 10 a.m. We will re-adjourn at 10:05. Are we now re-adjourned? Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Treasurer, I just want to confirm with the timeline. You mentioned the Under Treasurer confirmed that the final books of the budget papers were completed on Wednesday, the 7th of May, 2025. You're already out on the daily doing your fishing/volunteering at that date. How do you justify to Territorians that you were the Treasurer of the Northern Territory, you didn't take leave, and you're out in the daily on a boat fishing before the budget books were completed with the printing?
I'll just clarify the question, Mr. Chair. The Leader of the Opposition keeps making imputations that I was fishing. I've been very, very clear. I was volunteering at a community event. So the imputation that I was fishing is not correct. But whilst I was out, I do happen to have a Starlink in my boat, and I am in contact constantly through that technology with my office and with the team at Treasury. So whilst I'm not in the office, I am still in contact, as I would have been anywhere else in the Northern Territory, whether I was driving around in my electorate, whether I was driving up the Stewart Highway to come to Darwin for work, or whether I was out doing other duties as either the Treasurer or the Minister for Logistics for infrastructure. So whether or not I'm in my office, and whether, I suppose I need to clear up what actual leave is so people who are tuning in understand what that is. Politicians, yes, while we may take leave and then may abrogate our responsibilities to another minister, we actually don't get paid leave. We don't get leave, we don't get sick leave, the same as other MLAs do. So due to the technology that I had at hand, and of course not being in my office, I was able to still continue my duties as the Treasurer of the Northern Territory. So the fact that I was able to review, whether it be speeches, budget books, emails, other parts of work in my responsibilities as a minister, were not hindered in no way, shape or form because I was not in my office and volunteering for a community-based organisation.
I'll now, Leader of the Opposition, on this matter, if you have any follow-up questions, now's the time to ask on this particular matter, because then I'd like to actually close that, and I'll give also Member for Johnston, if you have any questions on this,
On the opening statement?
on the leave. No. Leader of the Opposition, do you have any more questions?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Treasurer, were any key Treasury briefings, pre-budget consultations or final budget sign-offs missed or delayed due to your absence?
No.
Thank you. And Treasurer, would you accept the same behaviour from a departmental CEO or executive disappearing before a major report deadline, such as the Northern Territory budget papers, and not declaring leave or refusing to hand their duties over to a responsible CEO to take their place while they are off duty?
The responsibilities between a CEO and a minister are very, very different in this respect. So I can't compare, i.e. what the Under Treasurer may or may not do leading into a budget cycle. But if required, for instance, if the Under Treasurer had to take leave, there are processes in place within Northern Territory Government for another person to step up and cover those responsibilities if required, if that was necessary. As I said, I was able to fulfil my duties as the Treasurer and as the Minister for Logistics and Infrastructure whilst not in my office, because luckily I had the technology to be able to do it. I can safely say that if the technology wasn't available and I couldn't do it, then I would have had to make some decisions as to what may take place. Would I have been able to go away and volunteer for that organisation? Would I have then actually had to abrogate my responsibilities to another minister? That would have been the decision that I had to make. But due to the technology that I had at hand, I was able to continue my duties and be able to do them as well as I could, whether I was in my office or whether I was out in a remote area doing my job as a local member or anywhere else in the Northern Territory, because I had that technology available to me.
Thank you. And through the chair, one other question on this particular topic, but I still have opening statement questions as well, Treasurer. Treasurer, do you accept that this time should have been used instead to perhaps talk to groups and stakeholders across the Northern Territory about the coming budget cuts that the CLP government have put in their 2025 budget? For example, the Aboriginal Rangers, which have been cut for the Aboriginal Ranger Grants program.
I suppose in answering that question, I was still able to communicate with various groups. There was a number of media releases done, and I spoke to the media whilst in the lead up to the budget. But the engagement with industry and stakeholders took place after the budget was handed down, so that those people had the opportunity to then look at the budget papers, see what was in the budget, and then come to us during those events that we attended to ask questions of government and what was in the budget and what it meant to them.
Okay, thank you, Treasurer. I'll now hand back over to Leader of the Opposition, and we'll consider this line of questioning closed, if you're happy with that, Opposition Leader. All right, over to you, Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'll save the rest of my questions for the outputs.
Okay, I'll now open to other questions, and I'll start with Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Treasurer, and everyone else. I've got some questions about GST. Can I ask them under this? Yeah. So, firstly, are you able to explain to me why the Northern Territory receives much higher GST distributions per person compared to all other states and territories?
I'll pass over to the Under Treasurer. He'll be able to give you probably a more detailed answer than I can.
Thank you.
The GST distributions are based on the relativity or the cost of providing a similar level of government services across all jurisdictions, and our highest share of GST per capita takes into account the cost of delivering services in a remote, widely dispersed population. But I'll hand over to Tarrant to provide a bit more detail on that.
Thank you, Tarrant Moore, Executive Director, Budget and Strategy. The Territory's relativity, one is basically a per capita share of the pool. Our relativity is much higher than that, as you've noted. That's because providing services in the Territory cost a lot more than the national average. So Aboriginal Territorians generally are higher users of government services than non-Aboriginal Territorians, and that's the same nationally. So the Commonwealth Grants Commission uses weightings to try to determine, how much more do certain cohorts of the population use government services, and therefore are more expensive per capita compared to other cohorts in the population. So some key drivers for us are remoteness. Obviously, it is more expensive to provide a government service in a remote area than in an urban area. As I mentioned, Aboriginal people tend to use government services more than non-Aboriginal people. There are also differences based on gender and age. For example, young males are much more likely to use justice services than older females, things of that nature. So all of those things combine together to give us a relativity much higher than one. On the other side of the equation is revenue. So the Commonwealth Grants Commission looks at the cost of providing government services and then the levels of revenue that you can generate per capita to meet the cost of those services. I'll just add that the relativity is about how much it costs to provide the national average level of service. It's not designed to meet outcomes or close the gap. That is not the purpose or how the methodology works for GST. That's achieved through specific purpose payments from the Commonwealth through things such as the Northern Territory Remote Aboriginal Agreement, which is focused on delivering services to close the gap. So we get more GST revenue principally because the cost of providing the average level of services is a lot higher in the Territory per capita than in southern states.
Thank you, and you've preempted some of my follow-up questions there, because I guess given what you've said, do you consider or does, I don't know who this question is to, that our very high GST distributions, as you've described them, may amount to needs-based funding, at least to some extent?
Thank you. They do, to the extent that the average level of services provided Australia-wide is meeting the need. If there are unmet needs at the national level, then no, it won't. And I think it's fair to say, because of the other payments that are made, for example, the Northern Territory Remote Aboriginal Agreement, that the GST processes and weightings alone are not fully needs-based. They, as I said, capture the average policy, what on average states actually do in this space, as opposed to what someone might deem that they need to do or should do. That is not how the GST process functions.
Okay. So just so I can understand properly, you've said that the GST funding is treated as totally separate to anything to do with closing the gap goals, for example. So as it's untied, correct? So as it is untied and as it's given to us, weighted given our particular needs in the Territory, how does the government ensure that it supports those closing the gap goals, especially in health, education, housing and employment for Aboriginal Territorians?
Thank you. So the closing the gap goals are generally met through specific purpose payments negotiated between the Territory and the Commonwealth Government. That'll be things such as the Remote Housing Agreement, which is a 50-50 contribution between the Commonwealth and the Territory Government, where that's excluded from consideration through the GST process, and that is designed to address overcrowding and unmet need in remote communities. So that's those sorts of things, and such as the Remote Aboriginal Agreement as well. They have separate agreements which are specifically tailored to close the gap in certain areas, whereas the GST funding is again to provide the average level of core services, teachers, nurses, doctors, that kind of thing. It's not of itself designed to close a gap or meet unmet need.
So are there any systems in place to track whether GST funding is actually reaching the communities most in need and not being absorbed elsewhere in the system?
It's difficult to determine exactly where all the funding goes. What I would say is that we have done Indigenous expenditure reports in the past, which shows that we spend more than we receive servicing Aboriginal and remote Territorians. So I know this question sort of has come up in the past. Where it gets tricky is that people sort of see the GST funding as being for, we receive more funding because we have more Aboriginal people and therefore we should be spending more. We do spend more, but again, it's not. That funding is not designed to close the gap, and often I think that's a misunderstanding of the processes of GST, whereas the closing the gap funding and the Northern Territory Remote Aboriginal Agreement funding, those agreements are tied to specific services and milestones, so you can sort of see where that money goes, whereas the GST funding, for example, we get more GST funding for schools per student. We can show that we're spending that money in schools and on health, but it's on core services. So, we have a hospital. Our hospitals are used more per capita by Aboriginal people than non-Aboriginal people. We have more nurses and doctors because of that. But that's harder to tie to specific patients.
So, and when you say there's some data available, where would we find that?
So there hasn't been an expenditure review sort of since COVID. It's been a number of years. They're very labour-intensive reviews to run. I think there was 2 or 3 run. Some of them were done by the Northern Territory initially, and then I believe the Productivity Commission ran one of them. The findings are pretty consistent, so there hasn't been one run since COVID to my knowledge.
Mm. And is there another one planned or? No, okay. So in terms of kind of reviews and evaluations and data around that, I guess my questions there again, how do we know how that's going? How do we know where the money's going?
Oh, I guess the budget dictates or explains where the money's going in terms of core government services and expenditure, and they're detailed quite clearly in the budget papers. We don't have any sort of, I guess, lines to say we received this much in GST and this proportion of it was spent in this department or delivering this service, but we do break down by classifications for expenditure where the money's been spent. So I guess that's the purpose of the budget, is to explain that.
Okay, thank you. And just so in terms of closing the gap, and so I understand that's seen as very separate from the GST funding. What role, in terms of determining how money around closing the gap targets is spent, what role do Aboriginal organisations and communities have in determining that?
Yeah, thank you, Member for Johnson, for the question. I suppose some of that money goes out in grants funding to different organisations. I know that the Territory assists a number of Indigenous organisations providing services either within urban or regional or remote communities. So I think that money would sit in grant funding or other direct funding from Northern Territory Government to those agencies. I'll just hand over to the Under Treasury, maybe some more detail.
Thank you to McManus. That's probably a question best answered by the Aboriginal policy area, maybe within CMC. But, for example, the Remote Aboriginal Investment Funding Agreement has been developed under a tripartite agreement with the Northern Territory Government, Commonwealth Government and the Aboriginal controlled organisation sector. So there is input through their peak bodies in that regard and development of that funding agreement and the targets and measures within it.
Thank you. And just in relation to, I guess this is my earlier question around GST evaluation, is there a way that Aboriginal communities can have access, or is there data around funding and services to deliver results in terms of the closing the gap targets? Is there a way that Aboriginal communities can get access to that data?
I understand the Commonwealth publishes the results of at particular milestones of the data and the targets and how we're achieving those. And I guess how we're positioned against the targets. So it'd be available publicly.
Thank you. Thank you. I also have some other questions which I'm not sure go here. I think you talked about the homeowner grants as part of your opening statement. Can I ask some questions about that here, or does it come under another? Yeah, okay. So I have some broad questions first about how many grants, what's the total amount of grants that have been given under each of the grant schemes?
Yeah, thank you, Member for Johnson. We do have that data here. Here we are. Oh, thanks, Mick. So in the homegrown, as of 10 June 2025, homegrown $10,000 for established dwellings, 89 in Alice Springs, 251 in Darwin, 16 in Katherine, 105 in Palmerston, 34 rural, 3 in Tennant Creek. For the $50,000 homegrown applications for new home builds, 1 in Alice Springs, 47 in Darwin, 2 in Katherine, 80 in Palmerston, 9 rural, none in Tennant Creek. And for the $30,000 Fresh Start grants, 1 in Alice Springs, 16 in Darwin, none in Katherine, 20 in Palmerston, 19 rural and none in Tennant Creek.
And can you tell me what date the first payments were made for those grants?
We'd have to take that on notice, Member for Johnson.
Thank you.
Member for Johnston, please restate the question for the record.
What date were the first payments made for the 3 grants, which I'm sorry, are called what are they?
The homegrown and Fresh Start grants.
The homegrown and Fresh Start grants. Thank you.
Treasurer, do you accept the question?
Yes, I do.
To give that question some context, I understand it's on notice.
Sorry, I'll just
I keep jumping
The question asked by the member for Johnston of the Treasurer has been allocated the number 2.2. Member for Johnston.
I understand from, and I saw when there was announcements made that people could apply for that from the date the announcement was made, but monies would be granted from the date the bill was passed. But I also noted that there was two media releases from the NTG, and the bill was passed on the 26th of November, which I remember because it's my birthday, but anyway, two media releases from the NTG, one on the 6th of November saying that 12 grants had been paid, and one on the 26th of November saying that 90 had been paid or approved. I'm just curious about how they may have been paid if the bill hadn't yet been passed.
I'll just pass over to Mick Butler, the Deputy Under Treasurer, who has a detail on that.
Thank you.
Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer. So in terms of the grant systems, there's two components to it, one of which is an administrative grant and one is requires the amendment of legislation. So the $50,000 grant for new homes and the $10,000 grant for established homes are done under the first homeowner grant, and that was the amendments to the legislation you're dealing with. The $30,000 Fresh Start grant is an administrative grant, so that one didn't require the legislation to be passed, and they all commenced from 1 October. What we had in place was basically took a risk-based approach to the fact that we understood the legislation was being passed. So in terms of the grants that were put in place under the legislation, they were administered and paid in accordance with the terms of the legislation as though it had been put in place, because the legislation, once passed, was retrospective back to the date of 1 October. So therefore authorising those grants.
So just to clarify, you did it because you knew the legislation would pass even though it hadn't come to Parliament yet?
Yes, on the understanding the legislation would be passed and the legislation would have effect from 1 October.
Yeah. Just for the record, as a Member of Parliament, I find it incredibly disturbing that you can act on a law that hasn't yet been passed by Parliament, understanding that the context is that we have a Parliament with, a huge government majority. That appears incredibly undemocratic to me. So I'd just like to put that on the record. Can I ask a couple more questions in terms of detail of the grants? Thank you. What specific evidence or data led to the decision to extend the $50,000 first homeowner grants for new builds to 30 September 26?
Again, I'll pass to Mick Butler, the Deputy Under Treasurer, who has more detail there.
Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer. So the Department of Treasury and Finance completed a review of the Home Grants Program, 6-month review of the program in April 2025. So we went through a process of having a couple of industry roundtables, collecting feedback for the review from banks, mortgage brokers, conveyancers, representatives of the building and construction body, some peak bodies, industry attendees. And the process of that was both to ensure that the administrative processes that we'd adopted through the grants were facilitating the grants and were, appropriate to ensure delivery of it. We went through some changes in the manner of which we did the grants in terms of the IT programs we used to deliver the grants to ensure that banks were comfortable with the, particularly the $30,000 grant, which was the administrative grant, and lined it up with the processes that we used for the first homeowner grant. So part of the review said, yep, they were very comfortable with the IT systems and approval processes behind it so that banks could utilise it in their assessment of applicants' financials. And the other part was to see, in terms of the way the grant was going out, who the recipients of grants were, the demographics of those receiving it, and whether or not it was basically achieving the effect that we were looking to do, because we had a lot of grants going out in the established space and I suppose a bit more of a lag in the new home space. And generally the consensus was that the grants were appropriate, they were driving demand into new homes, but there is a longer lead time on those grants, so that both in terms of builders gearing up and ensuring that they have appropriate workforces in place to deliver the housing as the demand comes through, but also for people who make the decision that they want to move into new homes, they have to both ensure that they have the appropriate savings history and savings in place to get to the grants. They have to make decisions around getting their finance, securing a piece of land, contracting with a builder. for the delivery. So that all of that time frame has basically meant that an extension of the grant would allow the full delivery of the program because people were just now ramping up through the delivery of the process, and the 12 months was probably not going to see the delivery of the full program. And so on that basis, the new home grants were extended and the established grant will cease in September.
And when you said you did a review, which sounds, you've talked about that involved talking to industry and banks, etc. I understand, if I'm correct, that the purpose of this loan is, and that's what the Treasurer you referred to build the NT population and build the economy. Have you got data in relation to that?
Sorry, in terms of the recipients?
In terms of the purpose is, I understand, the purpose of the scheme is to build the Northern Territory economy and to build our Northern Territory population.
Yeah. Yeah, so we are collecting data in terms of the cohorts of the recipients, so their ages, the demographics, whether they are from interstate or not, or from overseas. And we'll be using that data when we obviously undertake a program evaluation at the end of the grants.
Okay, and so that will be, when you say at the end of the grants, will that be September 26?
Yes, so post the cessation of the grants, we will undertake a normal program evaluation of the grants to give feedback to government on whether it achieved its objectives.
And how is compliance with the 12-month residency rule going to be implemented?
Our revenue officer are quite well versed in maintaining these grants, and so obviously there's a range of data that they use to basically match and do risk assessments on whether people are in the premises. So you obviously, without giving away to all the secrets, that you can check the administrative data in terms of driver's license and other things that show that it was your place of residence, who the bill is in there, power consumption that indicates that someone's actually living in the premises. So that's a lot of the data that lets you, I guess, target whether you need to then investigate further whether a person has lived in the property.
And what would be the consequences if people didn't, if someone didn't meet that 12-month residence?
It's part of the legislative criteria for the first homeowner grant, and the Act requires repayment of the grant if you haven't met the criteria. There is capacity in there for the Commission to make a decision allowing for a shorter term of residence where the circumstances are appropriate, and there's a sort of a guideline in place that frames the manner in which the Commission would make those decisions.
Thank you. And so did you say earlier that you could get information on the demographics of who was receiving those grants?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Is that something that I could take as a question on notice, or...?
Just anecdotally, in relation to your question, Member for Johnson, we have seen an increase in statistics around increased building and increased construction over the last quarters, and I believe that comes through from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So we have seen an increase in our construction industry, an increase in home loan approvals. So anecdotally, from those statistics that we see coming through from the ABS, we're seeing an increase in builds here in the Territory, investment in new builds. In relation to your question about demographics, I believe the Deputy Under-Treasurer has an answer for you.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take that question on notice. Member for Johnston, please restate the question for the record.
Could you provide demographic or regional data on who's receiving the grants, for example, age, income bracket and geographic location?
Treasurer, do you accept the question?
I do accept the question, Mr Chair, but that data will be de-identified.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
The question has been asked by the member for Johnston of the Treasurer and has been allocated the number 2.3. Member for Johnston.
I'm just wondering whether there's been any modelling on the inflationary impact of these grants on housing and build prices.
Again, I would pass to the Deputy Under-Treasurer.
So we haven't modelled an inflationary impact in terms of the cost of building or as an outcome of the grant. I think what we would do, however, is part of the program evaluation. That is one of the components we would look at. So in terms of the success and outcomes of the grant. You look at, did it move people into homes? Did it support construction? What were the economic outcomes of those construction? And one of the factors that would be, we would look at costs of building, and part of that would be, well, was there an inflationary effect, or was the cost of building just the normal outcomes of input costs? So that would form part of the program evaluation.
And in terms of evaluating this program as a success, this is a question for you, Treasurer. What would you see as a successful outcome? What impact are you hoping, like, in a tangible way from it?
I think there are a number of things that we would certainly measure to look at the success of the program. I think first and foremost would be construction, an increase in construction, like increases in the construction industry. More construction happening in the Territory, more people employed within the construction industry, increased spends locally from the construction industry with suppliers. I think that overall economic piece is quite critical to this program, because not only are we talking about increasing our population, but we're also talking about stimulating the construction industry and the economy. So that would be a key point. And the second part is population. Have we seen, and again, that would come as part of the review, is where have the people come from? Are they now living here in Darwin? Have we seen an increase in our population figures, even though it might be small, but any increase is certainly a benefit to the Territory. So they would be some of the key elements that we'll be looking at as part of review, and some of what we're trying to achieve with these grants is an increase in our population, more people residing in the Northern Territory, more people calling the Northern Territory home, but secondly also then not leaving. I know that we have a very large transient population in the Territory, so by people, and I think it's well known that generally if someone buys a house or builds a house, they're then less likely to leave. So if people are buying and building, they're more likely to reside in the Territory, which is, we're not losing population, we're maintaining and keeping. But secondly is that stimulation of the construction and building industry by increased activity, which means increased spending, and then of course that means increased revenue across the board for the Territory.
And as a numbers guy, what kind of numbers does that mean? What would be a good increased population as a result of this for you?
Well, that's probably very hard to quantify, Member for Johnson. If I could see an uptick of 0.1 or 0.2%, or even better, I'd certainly be happy. But any quantifiable increases in our projected population growth based on these grants is certainly a positive for the Territory. So it would show that by these grants are keeping people here or attracting people to the Territory. So that would certainly be a positive. For specific numbers in the economic side of the construction industry, look, we don't have any figures to date. We don't certainly have what I would say would be a goal. It's very hard to determine that because the construction industry fluctuates. But I think overall, through the ABS stats and then what we collect here, if we see a continued increase over the next 12 to 18 months in the construction industry, that would certainly point to the benefit of the grants stimulating the construction industry, and that taking into account with the increases we're seeing in home loan approvals, again, which is measured by the ABS and not specifically by us. So we'd be relying on that data to see what those increases are, and it's very hard to, I suppose, predict the net benefit to the Territory. I think that's something we could certainly do at the end of the scheme, and as we get towards the end of the scheme, and if we're looking at pulling all that data together and seeing what the net benefit is, construction industry, home loan approvals and population, that will certainly then, I would say, determine what the future looks like for for homeowner grants into the future.
Sure. And I understand it's very difficult to be specific about numbers when you just said 1 or 2%. So maybe 120 or 240 more people here potentially. Are you going to do a cost-benefit analysis of how much money's been put into this and what we get out of it?
Tim McManus, under Treasurer. Yeah, certainly that would form part of it. I guess with population, it may not necessarily result in an additional population, but I guess it's targeted at those people who are currently in the Territory renting, purchasing their own place, and I guess setting their roots in the Territory and staying in the Territory. So we may not have as much of an impact on attracting new people to the Territory. I mean, we are the most generous homeowner incentive grants in the nation. But I think the main target will be about maintaining the existing population and seeing less outflows there. Another part of the program, or another benefit of it, is to increase the overall housing stock in the Territory, and by doing that, taking pressure off the rental market and make sure there's availability for others who do come to the Territory for that, and at affordable prices.
That's okay. Just from before, from the question from the member for Johnston to the Deputy Under Treasurer about looking at inflationary pressures, and I understood your answer was that there'll be an evaluation afterwards to look at that if there was any. But does that mean, sorry, that there was no part of the planning of this, that you did no modelling to look at what potential inflationary pressures, housing increases, like costs, or looked at other examples interstate in terms of how some of these schemes can inflate the housing market?
Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer. We have undertaken a review in the past of the outcomes of previous homeowner grants and have looked at those in terms of, one of the outcomes of those is they can tend to have an inflationary effect on housing prices where demand, I guess, exceeds supply, or where the demand that is either brought forward or increased by the schemes occurs in a situation where particularly you don't have sufficient supply of land. We have seen previously that there's been inflationary effects. One of the considerations going into this grant scheme was we looked at both the amount of titled land that was available and through the departments that was planned to be released over the periods of the grants. And we saw that that was different from the previous grants where we had put those in place, that was sufficient titled land for the expected level of demand and the amount of grants that had been funded. So our expectation was that that inflationary effect wouldn't occur. So I guess that's the evaluation we did. We didn't model an inflationary outcome.
Just one more question. And I think I've asked you about this before, Treasurer, in terms of concerns about the Master Builders Fidelity Fund and the impact of that on the building and housing sector, and just wondering how that is interacting with this new home build.
Thank you, Member Johnson. I think that question's probably better off passed on to Minister Burgoyne, because it forms...
Oh, that's who I've asked before, sorry. Yes, yeah.
That forms part of his remit, not specifically here with Treasury.
Okay, thank you.
Member for Arafura.
Thank you, Chair. So similar questions around the homegrown territory grant. Why are you scrapping the 10,000 homegrown territory grant on 30th September, given how popular it is?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. When we're looking at the the first homeowners grants overall, the 10, the 30 and the 50, we have seen a large increase in the $10,000 grants. Now, there is the opportunity for people to access a federal grant towards existing buyers of existing homes. What we were specifically looking to do with the grants is to stimulate our construction industry along with new homes, in particular, as we've just mentioned to the member for Johnson. So we need to increase housing supply, and we want people building and moving into new homes. So yes, we did see a huge uptake in the $10,000 for people, new homeowners buying existing homes, but the specifics of what we would need to achieve for the territory is new builds. So new builds, increasing our housing stock, stimulating our home build and construction industry. So those were the decision points around what the grant is going to look like going forward. So we'll be specifically targeting the $30,000 and the $50,000 grants for new builds. And as I said, there is a federal grant available that people can apply for first homeowners for existing.
Thank you, Treasurer. Treasurer, you stated you would review the scheme before extending it. Have you actually done a review? And why wouldn't you keep an option that is obviously popular with Territorians?
I'll pass to the Deputy Under Treasurer about the review that we've spoken about.
Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer. So, yeah, I guess just to clarify too, in terms of the $10,000 grant, it, like the $30,000 and the $50,000 grants, was a new grant introduced by this government, and it was always intended to be, a limited time stimulus measure. In conducting the review, I guess what we found is that the $10,000 grant being for established homes didn't have that lag time in terms of its take-up. Because it was for established homes, you had people who were already in the market looking to move into homes and were able to avail themselves of the assistance pretty much immediately because you weren't having to locate land, contract with a builder, have the building industry ramp up. So it had achieved its outcomes as it was intended to occur. What we found with the new homes was that it needed an extension of time to fully deliver through because of that lagged effect. So one had achieved its outcomes and needed to cease, and then, as the Treasurer said, the other one needed further time to ensure that people could avail themselves of it. And government made the decision that it was focusing on ensuring that the dual aims of the new home grants in terms of both home ownership and stimulation of the construction industry was to occur. So that scheme was extended. So I guess just to say it wasn't scrapped, it's ceasing at the time it was always intended to cease, and the $30,000 and the $50,000 grants were extended.
Will the government publicly release any independent evaluation or an analysis of the program's impact on affordability, equity, and market performance?
Thank you, Member Farrer, for the question. Yes, as we've said, at the end of the program, there will certainly be an evaluation, and we're certainly happy to make that evaluation public as to what we've achieved and what the outcomes of that have been.
No more question. Thank you, Treasurer.
Member for Karama.
Thank you, Treasurer. As you know, I'm a pretty passionate supporter of local content and building local content capacity. Now, this question may not belong to you, and please tell me if it belongs to another minister or otherwise. But I'm very conscious about local content weighting and doing that in favour to help stimulate local business. We will be asking questions of various agencies because they report on their contracts. I know this is in your other output. I think Department of Logistics and Planning, I see that there were 256 contracts awarded locally, 10 awarded outside the NT. So that's a good example, I think, of commitment. And there's always exceptions as to why you might want to do that. Should I direct the broader question of how do we monitor in government our commitment or push the commitment for local content? Is it through Treasury or is it back through Minister Carl or whatever? Or can you speak just broadly as a commitment on behalf of government?
Thank you, Member for Karama. Local content is extremely valuable to the Territory because that means it's Territory businesses working for the Territory, and of course that money stays in the Territory. And the more local content we have, which means that spend by government stays in the Territory. Now, quite a bit of that would sit with Minister Carl in Department of Trade, Business and Asian Relations. Okay. Okay, so we actually do an annual review of procurement and contract management activities of each agency. So that happens within Treasury. And I know that there's changes within the Department of Treasury and Finance since coming into government. There's a greater focus on contracts from Treasury being effectively the financial body and has that expertise within the agency. So there is some ability for analysis and I suppose audits of those contracts. I'm happy to pass to the Under Treasurer to provide some more detail.
Thank you. Tim McManus, Under Treasurer. You're right. The Northern Territory Government Value for Territory Assurance Program requires an annual compliance review of procurement and contract management activities for each agency to assess their compliance with the procurement framework, and that includes the buy local policy. And so each year the buy local industry advocate provides an independent advisory function to government on behalf of the local industry and assesses each agency's compliance with procurement, and in particular looking at the value for territory and engagement with territory businesses through the procurement framework.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair, just on buy local, has that position remained under this budget or has it been scrapped?
Yeah, thank you, Leader of the Opposition. I think that might be a question for Minister Carl under Trade, Business and Asian Relations.
Any further questions? Treasurer, I have a question myself, and it's related to debt. So what is our current debt?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Oh, excuse me. I'll pass to Tiziana Hucent, the Executive Director for Finance, to provide some detail.
Thank you, Tiziana Hucent, Executive Director Finance. Sorry, Chair, were you talking to net debt or borrowings? Just to clarify.
Net debt.
Net debt. So the Territory is projected to have net debt in 25-26 at 12 billion, increasing to 13.9 billion by 28-29.
Thank you. And on our borrowings, can you break down our borrowings and interest rates we have on them?
Yes, thank you. Borrowings are projected to be 15.9 billion in 25-26, increasing to 18.3 billion by 28-29. And our weighted cost of borrowings in terms of interest rates, at the moment we're at 5.42, and it's held steady at 5.5% over the forward estimates.
Thank you. And Treasurer, coming to the, and this might be for the next part in the appropriation bill, so if you'd rather answer it there, please let me know. In this budget, how much has been allocated to projects of the former government? So how much money have your government spent following on previous commitments?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. There are very few new projects from this current government in this budget. The majority of this budget is funding pre-existing, I suppose, initiatives and programs from the previous government. I think the easiest one to explain would be the infrastructure budget. So it's 1.25 or $1.26 billion in cash going into the infrastructure budget. Those are not new projects of the current government. These are dealing with legacy issues from the previous government. So those were projects that were underway that can't be stopped, that would cost more money to cease than it would be to continue them, and expose the Northern Territory to legal costs. So if you look at the infrastructure program as a larger part of that, that is all dealing with the previous government's infrastructure program. And then I suppose leading into the next few years' budgets, then we can start looking at what the infrastructure program looks like as some of these projects are completed and we're able to put new programs on and stay within our cash limits and not have to borrow more to deliver on that program. But when you look at the overall agencies outside of Department of Logistics and Infrastructure and that construction program, the majority of that is dealing with, as I said, previous commitments and programs from the previous government. So there's very, very little change in that expenditure with the change of government.
So you gave that figure 1.8 billion. Do you have an exact figure that could be
on the infrastructure? In terms of infrastructure cash.
So I'll clarify the question. So in the current government's budget, how much is allocated to in the infrastructure budget, how much is allocated to works that came from the previous government?
So thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. If we look at the infrastructure program and the cash allocated to it, so there's I believe $170 million going into corrections infrastructure for their program, which is wasn't part of the original program. And if you look at specifically for Alice Springs, we reprioritised. So it's not effectively any new money, it was existing. There was $25 million towards moving or creating a new rugby oval out at 𝙍𝙬𝙼𝙍𝙍. We reprioritised that money to deliver on other projects within Central Australia and Alice Springs, that being a grant to the Council for the Library. There's now, it was $5 million towards the Multicultural Centre, money towards the sporting ovals along Memorial Drive. I'm trying to remember what else. A commitment. The skate park, $4.2 million towards the Tourism Central Australia's move into the library, and some remediation works at the old Shell fuel depot adjacent to Anzac Hill. So that was reprioritised money from not progressing the oval at 𝙍𝙬𝙼𝙍𝙍. So we took that money and reprioritised it within Central Australia. So out of that, if you look at that $1.2+ billion in cash for the infrastructure program, the only new stuff from this government really is around the infrastructure program for corrections.
Thank you, Treasurer. And so when do you assess, like how many budgets will these previous government's projects last for? When will you be able to fund the current government's anticipated work?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And looking at DLI, I suppose there are a number of projects coming to completion. So the State Square Art Gallery will come to completion next year, I believe. So that program will cease. Pandora across the harbour there, that should come to completion later this year, early next year. So that program ceases. The ship lift will continue on. That program's not due for delivery until was it late 2026, early 2027, I believe. That's a large proportion of that infrastructure cash. That program has increased exponentially from the original budget that was allowed for the ship lift. That's increased by nearly, I think, $300 million from the last increase back in 2024, I believe. So as some of these projects come off and are completed, then we can start looking at how the infrastructure cash is then utilised to develop, to start delivering on the infrastructure program of this government. At the moment, we're still dealing with the infrastructure program of the last government.
Thank you, Treasurer. Time now is 11 a.m. We'll break for 15 minutes and re-adjourn at 11:15. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Time now is 11:15 and we'll reconvene. We are still on questions of the opening statement with the Treasurer. Member for Nightcliff.
Mr Chair, before we proceed, I do have an answer to a question on notice.
Yep, please proceed. Could you please state
for the member
question?
for Johnson. Okay.
Treasurer, could you please state the question number?
It was first homeowner payment dates.
Question on notice is 2.2, Treasurer.
Yes, so the dates for payment of the grants for the first homeowner grant, $10,000. The first one was paid on the 17th of the 10th, 2024. For the Fresh Start grant, $30,000. The first payment was made on the 8th of the 1st, 2025. And for the first homeowner grant of $50,000, the first payment was made on the 14th of November, 2024.
Thank you, Treasurer. Thank you. Member for Nightcliff.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Through the Chair. So does either the Treasurer or the Department can answer any of these, or the Treasurer, I guess. Does the Treasurer and the Department accept the science of anthropogenic climate change and the risks it poses to the NT's economy?
Yeah, thank you, Member for Nightcliff. Yes, we do accept climate change. Apart from that, I think it's certainly not something for Treasury. It's more of a policy decision rather than a specific output of Treasury.
Thank you, Treasurer. Well, I mean, the reason why I do think it pertains to this, your department, we've got our economy and industries such as agriculture, aquaculture, tourism, and are highly vulnerable to climate impacts. Now, nowhere in this budget have I seen a climate risk assessment or a climate risk framework, as there are in all other state and territory budgets. So other state and territories have, to some different degree, types of climate risk analysis, mitigation measures. So I just want to know how it was determined that it was unnecessary to include any climate risk assessment or adaptation framework as established as best practice in other government financial risk management.
Thank you for the question, Member for Nightcliff. I'll pass to the Under-Treasurer.
Tim McManus, Under-Treasurer. The Territory Government's currently preparing for future climate-related reporting requirements in compliance with the new accounting standards. But I'll pass over to Tiziana Hucent, Executive Director Finance, for further detail on it.
Thank you, Tiziana Hucent, Executive Director Finance. The Australian Accounting Standards Board has issued new climate reporting requirements. It's called S2, and at the moment that S2 reporting requirements is only applicable to the corporation sector, and it's in a phased approach dependent on that corporation's revenue size, asset base and the like. And those new climate reporting requirements will require those entities to do climate resilience and scenario analysis, as well as greenhouse gas emission disclosures and metrics and targets. Our Power and Water Corporation will be disclosing for the first time in 25-26 in compliance with this reporting standard. And then Territory Generation and Jakarta Energy will follow in the following 2 years. However, the Territory Government is preparing for those disclosures to be applicable to the not-for-profit sector for when they do. Currently, no other jurisdiction prepares consolidated reporting on climate-related risks or analysis. However, the Office of Sustainable Energy has undertaken reporting for whole of government and done some work in this space, so that question's probably better directed to them. However, from Treasury's perspective, we are planning for those reporting disclosures for when they do become applicable to us, which will include that climate analysis and risk assessments.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm glad to hear that. So that is going to pertain to agencies and how they... Okay, and so that's coming up in the next sort of financial year? Is that what you...
For the corporation sectors only, so only entities who have to comply with the Corporations Act are mandated to comply with those reporting standards. However, like all accounting Australian accounting standards, they do tend to then convert and require not-for-profit sector entities to comply at some stage. So we're anticipating those to be applicable to the not-for-profit sector, being governments, in the next coming years, and we will be ready to do that reporting from a whole of government perspective.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that answer. I mean, I still think there's an element, and that's really great inclusion, and I'm happy to see that happening. There's still an element, though, you see in other states and territories and other governments across the world where Treasury and budgets, and in part of their financial planning, they themselves look at, like, how do we mitigate for issues with insurance that are going to come up. So, look, I'll just ask some specific, and we still don't see that in this budget, and that's what I'm trying to get to, why that was deemed not necessary.
Thank you. So in our budget papers, we do have a risks section where we talk about risks to the budget. And in there, we do discuss risks in relation to natural disasters in particular, and the impact that that may have on our fiscal aggregates should there be a cyclone, and the impacts that that has on our expenditure as well as our revenue inflows from our entities providing paying payroll tax and the like. So we do provide that generic risk. Obviously, with natural disasters, you can't predict them, and so it's we're unable to quantify those risks at the moment in terms of until that event occurs, and then there's estimates on expenditure in terms of damage and what that costs to the budget. We can't quantify those, so it's just a generic risk statement.
Yeah, and that's what I guess I'm getting at. So it's generic. Yes, we have natural disasters, but there's nothing in there that kind of puts in the fact that climate change accelerates those risks and what that looks like going forward.
So as part of our transition to compliance with that S2 reporting standard, Treasury will mandate for agencies to start risk assessments and include in their risk registers climate risk, and in particular to our asset base from a tertiary government perspective and our service delivery capacity in any areas that might be affected by climate risks. So that's coming as part of the transition and compliance with the new reporting standard.
Okay, so coming soon. Yeah. So just another question. So some of the risks to infrastructure and economy include changes to financial systems, for example, the availability of funding and insurance for infrastructure projects. Once again, if we don't have a climate risk framework in this budget, how are you addressing these economic risks?
Well, I suppose we assess the economic risk, particularly around, if you're talking insurance, around what we currently know. With what Tiziana's speaking about, with the possibility of that S2 framework then being required of government, and then there'll be a point where those risks will be identified as part of that reporting procedure, and then would form, I suppose, part of the assessment when we're looking at different projects, government assets, tenders that are being released, as far as insurance and other pieces go. So at the moment, no, it's not included. If the S2 reporting requirements come to government, which we seem to think they will, then there will be a requirement, and we'll have that data, because then it will be collected from agencies as to how it then may be applied to what we're doing in a territory context.
Okay. I mean, I guess it's 2025, and I'm just really surprised. I'm glad to hear that it's coming, but right now, currently in 2025, for example, looking at the risks to insurance, you're saying there's nothing in this budget in terms of addressing the climate risk to that.
No, that's correct.
Thank you. I have some other questions, but I think they might be under outputs around the changes to the gambling cap on tax. Will that be under taxation later? Yep. I'll wait till later outputs. Well,
it's up to you, member for Nycliffe. You can ask them now, because I mentioned it in my opening statement. It's up to you. You can ask now, or so that I can provide answers later in the outputs.
Okay, thank you. All right. Considering the NT's revenue from the gambling industry, so our revenue sits at around 145 million, and yet the Menzies School of Health Research has quantified the total social costs of gambling to be between 165 and $380 million. Does the Treasurer consider the full economic impacts of gambling when considering its viability as a revenue stream, as well as when considering the increase to gambling taxation?
I'll pass to the Deputy Under Treasurer to speak about the changes to the regime as far as the Gambling Act is concerned, where we're talking about the revenue units and the changes in percentage. So I'll throw across to Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer.
Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer. Yeah, so the assessment of the changes for the gambling taxes is largely predicated on moving away from what is currently an agreements-based regime. So the Act, particularly in relation to internet gaming, provides for taxation to be set by agreements between providers and the government. Government has moved to legislate it and ensure that there is transparency in terms of taxation. It's not by negotiation. It's a set rate that's imposed on all providers. That provides certainty to an industry, certainty to Territorians as to the level of taxation that will be imposed upon internet gaming providers. In terms of the changes to the sports bookmakers tax cap, that was taken on the basis of ensuring that, I guess, balancing between ensuring a fair return to government for the provision of regulatory services in the environment for those providers, bearing in mind that they are subject to a range of taxation across point of consumption taxes in every other jurisdiction. So you have to look at their entire tax load that they are subject to across Australia and ensure that the industry is capable of paying a fair return to government. So it's balancing those two objectives. So that was the methodology by which we undertook those taxation changes.
Okay. And so, sorry, just to clarify that the social costs of and the social costs of harms of gambling doesn't take into consideration in terms of what it's costing versus what we're taxing?
No, member for Nightcliff, no, it doesn't. So as the Deputy Under Treasurer has spoken about, it's assessing what's, I suppose, what's payable and reasonably payable from those gambling entities. Treasury doesn't then balance that against what you may say with the Menzies School of Research says is the cost of the community of gambling.
Okay, so the cost of the community is not factored in. Okay. Talking about that cap on the tax that I realise that was increased from 1 million to 2 million revenue points, as I understand. So this equates to an increase from 1.4 million to 2.8 million on an industry that is headquartered here with a $50 billion turnover. 2.8 million doesn't seem like a lot to, I think, a lot of people. Why was it only increased to 2 million revenue points? Could it be more?
Again, thank you for the question. I'll pass to Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer.
Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer. I guess it depends on your frame of reference. I mean, yes, looking at it as a percentage of the turnover of the industry, it is a small amount. Probably a better point of comparison would be to make a comparison to what these entities are taxed. So these entities are subject to point of consumption tax in every jurisdiction. So every state and territory of Australia imposes a tax on these industries for bets taken by residents of those states and territories. So that alludes to their total tax load. If the territory was to impose a tax in the same manner, a point of consumption on residents in our territory, we would actually get a lot less revenue. So from that point of comparison, the tax that we impose based on just the industry turnover with a cap to come to a level actually, I guess, provides a tax base bigger than we would were we to tax them on the same basis as every other jurisdiction. So in a per capita basis, we are taxing them at a much higher rate than every other state does. In terms of setting the cap, what we're trying to do is ensure that we have to be mindful of what their total tax load is. So they pay Commonwealth income taxes, they pay point of consumption taxes in every jurisdiction, which also get increased at points in time depending on industry events in those states. So they have this total taxation load and the capacity to pay a certain amount of tax in the territory. We tax them at a rate higher than we would where we tax them on a point of consumption, and we're just trying to set it at a level where we can get what we consider an appropriate return, but doesn't drive them out of being regulated in the territory and us losing that taxation revenue altogether.
I mean, the taxation regime here for online gambling companies has been described as like a light touch, and there's a reason why they're all here. Is there room? We obviously have got issues with debt. is there room for that to be increased so we can get more from these massive billion-dollar industries?
Yeah, I guess that our assessment was that the room we had to move was where we moved that level of taxation to.
Okay.
Can I have a follow-up question, Chair?
Member for Karama.
Thank you. Just following up on the member for Nightcliff. So can you just confirm our per capita rate is the highest in the country, tax on these organisations, or not?
Yeah,
I don't want to misinterpret, or did I
Sorry,
misinterpret?
no, I don't want to describe it that way. I would say that if we imposed a tax that was based on consumption in the territory, at say the average of the other states, which sort of 10 to 15% on bets that occur in that jurisdiction, we would raise less revenue than we do under the methodology that we currently utilise.
So just confirming, this method gives us more revenue than going back to the previous method.
Well, than imposing it in the same manner that the other jurisdictions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Member for Nightcliff.
I've got no more on gambling, but I might ask you something on a different topic, if that's okay. Oh, no, go for it.
Sorry, thank you. Through the chair, just following on from the member for Nightcliff and the member for Karama. Treasurer, did the government consult with the gambling and hospitality industry before announcing or introducing the new gambling tax?
No, and I've been asked this a number of times by the industry. We didn't go out and consult with the industry prior to implementing these changes, and there were specific reasons for this. If we were going to go out and speak to that industry about changing their taxation regimes, we knew the answer that we were already going to get. There would have been opposition, and they would not have agreed with the changes. So the decision was made not to consult with industry. We advised industry just prior to the bill being introduced, and we've since engaged with industry post that announcement. But yeah, the decision was made not to engage with industry prior to.
Treasurer, did your government receive any advice or warnings from the affected companies about this new tax regime, which may impact the future investment or employment in the territory of those companies who are based here?
Yeah, just nothing specific to the legislation, Leader of the Opposition. There are always people coming in from the gambling industry advocating for lower taxation regimes for their industry so that they can, of course, maximise and maintain or increase their profits. So, yes, there's been much discussion from numerous organisations leading into, but they're all about lowering their taxation regimes to make it more beneficial for their organisations.
Treasurer, how does the government expect to do business here in the territory and plan for investment with companies in the territory when tax settings can be changed without warning or consultation?
Well, you're only talking about one specific business and industry here in the territory, but there are many other things we're doing to work with business and industry across the territory to improve our taxation regimes and improve our regulatory regimes to attract business here. And I suppose the first one would be the changes to the payroll tax regime, increasing that from 1.5 to 2.5 million, which benefits many small to medium businesses across the territory and saves some of those businesses up to $68,000 per annum, which they can then reinvest into their business. I could talk at length of the work that's taking place with the Fast Track Approvals Task Force. And again, that's about looking at what government does and how it does it and improving our timeframes about how we then work with business and changing and improving those regulatory frameworks to make the territory an easier place to do business. We're hopefully seeing that report come out in another few days, and I believe the Chief Minister spoke at length about it yesterday. Territory Coordinator is another piece of work to deliver for the territory.
Could we stick to gambling question?
I'll let the Treasurer go. I think I didn't see an issue with the answer he was giving, but yeah, Treasurer.
Well, we were talking about taxation regimes and regulatory reform for business. So, of course, gambling is one of a small part of a larger piece of what is territory business and territory industry. So if we're looking, again, I'll go back to the territory coordinator. The territory coordinator position has been implemented to drive investment, find investment, and make sure that investment happens here in the territory. And that's about regulatory reform and driving and changing how we do business. So, yes, in this instance, yes, there's a change in the taxation regime for a business or a subset of businesses here in the territory. But then, of course, you look at the rest of business in the territory, there's a lot of regulatory reform and a lot of change going on to drive investment and to grow our economy through that regulatory reform. So, yes, there's been some changes to the racing and gaming and online betting area in relation to taxation. We certainly do not believe that they are outside the ballpark when you consider what we're doing with other jurisdictions. Funnily enough, I believe that we are not the lowest taxing environment in the country. I believe Tasmania is the lowest taxing environment, but we do have the best regulatory framework in the country in relation to online gambling and our racing and wagering, and that's something that we're quite proud of, and we've given the assurances to the industry that we're not going to change that. If anything, we're going to probably improve it and make it easier for them to do business. But there's a requirement for those doing business here in the territory in this area, in racing and gaming and online betting, that they pay a reasonable amount of tax to the territory for the business that they do here.
Through the Chair, Treasurer, can your government categorically rule that you will not be introducing any further taxes, levies or charges during this term?
No.
So is it your intention, Treasurer, that you will increase taxes, charges and levies and will not consult on it?
I didn't say that, Leader of the Opposition. I can certainly say in relation to the racing, gaming and wagering industry that I've given you assurance to that industry that there'll be no taxation changes in their area for the term of this government. So I don't know what's going to happen after 4 years. Well, will I be in government? Will I not be in government? Will somebody else be in government? I said I could not give them that assurance, but for the next 4 years, for the term of this government, there'll be no changes to the taxation regimes for online wagering and racing and gaming.
And lastly, Treasurer, just on this topic, is this a prime example of the CLP government saying one thing before the election and then doing the opposite after being elected?
Absolutely not, member for the Leader of the Opposition.
So it's not an example of promising not to do something without consultation and then doing it without consultation after the fact.
This government never said leading into the election that we wouldn't be reviewing taxation regimes on racing, gaming, wagering and online betting.
Thank you, Chair.
Are there any further questions on the opening statement? Okay, the committee will now proceed to consider the estimates of proposed expenditure contained in the Appropriation Bill 25-26 that relate to the Department of Treasury and Finance. Are there any agency-related whole-of-government questions on budget and fiscal strategies? Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Chair. I believe my first questions are around Output 1 financial management, so I'll reserve until then. Thank you.
Anyone else? No. That concludes consideration of agency-related whole-of-government questions on budget and fiscal strategies. The committee will now proceed to Output Group 1, Financial Management, Output 1.1, Financial Management. Are there any questions?
Thank you,
Leader
Chair.
of the Opposition.
Treasurer, can you confirm when the SAGE Integrated Budget Management System will be finalised and when is it expected to be fully operational across all NT government agencies?
Thank you, Leader of the Opposition. I'll hand to Tiziana for that answer.
Thank you, Leader for the Opposition. Yeah, thank you. So we're currently in the rollout phase of SAGE. So we've got 12 agencies onboarded at the moment, and we're expecting to have full rollout across the NTPS by December this year.
Thank you very much. And further to that, Treasurer, will agencies be required to publicly report budget variances using the data from SAGE to help improve public trust in how taxpayer dollars are managed by the government?
Again, I'll refer to Tiziana for an answer on that.
Thank you. Yes, SAGE will deliver significantly new enhanced reporting capabilities for agencies, and they will have access to reporting by outputs from a budget and actual perspective. So agencies and Treasury and whole of government will have significantly more data and analysis capabilities with Sage. So yes, to answer your question, yes, they will be able to report that.
Thank you. And just further to that detail, will that be publicly available and would it be live and in real time?
Yes, so that data will be used to create the budget process. So the budget output reportings in BP3 will be derived from Sage budgeting, as well as their annual reporting, their actuals and their budget, and I suppose their variances to budget for outputs in their annual reports will also be derived from Sage reporting.
Thank you. And is there a costing for the new Sage development in the process, and what is that?
So we expect that Sage will cost around the total cost on completion of rollout will be around $14 million, and that's been fully funded through Treasury.
Thank you. And if there is a breach of any financial management rules or budget principles, will the Treasurer immediately implement any consequences, and will that be to the CEO, CFO, or a delegated official?
Yeah, thank you, Leader of the Opposition, for the question. And of course, there will be a requirement for strengthened budget accountability down through the CEOs from myself and, of course, from all the other ministers. So under the Executive CEO Code of Conduct, there is a framework dealing with financial matters. So under the framework, agency budget performance is assessed for compliance within, of course, those employee expense caps we spoke about, operational expense caps, and, of course, budget outcomes, so total revenue less expenses. So throughout the year, Treasury, of course, will monitor agencies' performance and their compliance against those effective 3 caps. So updates on those assessments will generally be provided for the Budget Review Subcommittee of Cabinet on a quarterly basis. And of course, Treasury and Finance assessed every agency against each cap at the end of the financial year to determine potential rewards or penalties. And Treasury provides submissions to the Executive Remuneration Review Panel and BRS against those parameters as well. So those caps will be monitored by Treasury, and of course, as I said, then they'll be referred to BRS, and then, of course, down through ministers through their CEs to manage any issues we see around those 3 caps.
Thank you, Treasurer. And can you provide any examples around what consequences or penalties would be then enforced?
This one here.
So thank you, Leader of the Opposition. So CEO accountability hasn't changed from previous government. So there are a number of action items. So, of course, there's the ability to issue a formal warning to a CEO. There's a direct and independent financial review of an agency, should that be required. There's depending on how serious things are, there can be the suspension of the CE for serious breaches or even termination of the CE. So nothing has changed in this space from the previous government.
Member for Fanny Bay.
Thank you, Chair. Treasurer, when I go out and speak to members of my community, one of their biggest concerns is the financial debt that we're currently in. And I'm just wondering if you can provide some information around what this appropriation bill contributes to this figure compared to some of the unbalanced budgets of the previous government.
So if we look at some of the reasons why we've ended up in the position that we're in, and I will throw to the Under Treasurer to talk about the high level numbers. When we see some of those time limited initiatives, or as I call it, funding cliffs, the commitments reflected from the mid-year report. There was $16 million in 25-26 that we've increased, and $36 million ongoing for domestic family and sexual violence prevention measures. That was falling away. Of course, we've seen the input we've put in place to reducing crime, $86 million and $126 million per annum for costs associated with rising prisoner numbers, which again was not included in previous budgets. There was none of this moving forward from the previous 24 budget. $63 million over the budget cycle 27-28 for funding to support urgent legislative amendments to reduce crime and operational systems associated with delivering whole of government ICT systems. We had to put in $1.5 million in capital development, again associated with ICT. A decision from the previous government to accept the World Motocross GP. The funding line provided of that was minimal, and once we actually got in and had a look at that, there was a shortfall of $6.5 million to deliver on that program. So there's an additional expense we've had to put in place, otherwise we would have been in breach of contract, which then brought a financial penalty. Of course, we've put in $18 million to boost construction of home ownership through those homegrown and fresh start grants, as we've spoken about earlier. And of course, there's another $40 to $50 million per annum ongoing, so in 25-26, 40 and 50 in 26-27 to address the expected increase in prisoner numbers within corrections and those demand pressures. There's an additional $13.5 million 24-24. There's $13.5 24-25 and $21.5 ongoing from 25-26 to deal with those justice system demand pressures. So these are the things that weren't considered with the increase in police. There was no increase in budget within corrections or the justice system, those being courts. We've invested $10 million in 24-25 to 26-27 and $2 million ongoing to support the upgrades to the JESC and $6.6 million for physical upgrades to that facility. And of course, there's $130 million 24-25 and $180 million 25-26 to support delivery of infrastructure projects. We've increased R&M, and this is a major boost to the Territory. R&M has always sat at very stagnant levels. We've increased R&M by $20 million into the new budget, but what we've also done is we've indexed that at 3%, so that keeps increasing, because we've seen an increase in government assets being built through the infrastructure program, but no additional money being put into R&M, and it certainly hasn't been indexed to deal with inflation going forward. So we've made the decision to do that so that we can actually look after and support those assets that we have here in the Territory, rather than see them falling away due to lack of maintenance because of lack of budget. $8 million per annum ongoing from 25-26 for visitor information centres. $2 million ongoing 25-26 to 26-27 to support skilled migration, and that works towards growing our population and increasing skilled workers here in the Territory, because we are struggling. We want to develop our economy. We want to see growth in our economy. But to do that, we need people to come and live here and work as well, so that we're putting an investment into that. And we spoke earlier about the ship lift. So there's $305 million 25-26 and 26-27 to continue the development of the Darwin ship lift facility. The Darwin ship lift will be a large asset to the Northern Territory and help with our economic growth within the maritime industry, supporting not just the Territory's maritime industry, but those in Northern Australia and, of course, out into Asia. And we're working closely with Defence so that they are able to utilise that facility as well. So we'll form a cornerstone of our economy in the top end moving forward. So I'll just throw to Tim for some of the higher numbers.
Thank you, Treasurer. I guess in terms of net debt, the impact of all of those expenditure decisions netted with additional revenues that were received. At the time of the in August 2024, just before the election, the pre-election fiscal outlook forecast net debt to be in 24-25 to be 10.8 billion, and that has increased now under the current budget, increasing to in this current financial year, it's reducing by 273 million to 10.5. In the PFO, by 27-28, net debt was forecast to reach 2.25 million. It's currently, under the current budget, it's forecast to reach 13.5 billion by the out year, by 27-28. So an increase of $1.2 billion in net debt as a result of this budget since the PFO.
And with some of that key funding that was expiring from the 24-25 budget, there's 110 million in 24-25 expiring from the Department of Health. So that was a temporary budget, so that wasn't included in the forwards. There was $20 million per annum disappearing from youth justice out of that 24-25 budget. Another $20 million per annum ongoing for tourism initiatives. So that, again, that was not funded going forward, even though those programs were going to continue. $18 million per annum for justice demand pressures, such as alternative to custody and victims of crime support. And in addition, there were further funding reductions budgeted related to step-down funding for corrections and justice services, which I've spoken about, which were predicated on reduced offending and prisoner numbers. And we've seen crime escalating and budgets actually reducing in those areas, which just absolutely didn't make sense. And certainly wasn't in context, of course, with what we've seen, the changes in the police budget. So their budget was increasing and others were decreasing. So, and there was temporary infrastructure funding of $250 million was also budgeted to cease in 25-26. And that, as I've said, is against a record capital works program under the previous government of $5.2 billion. So they're actually reducing cash while increasing the program. So all of those things that needed to be funded to support the Territory and provide those services that we needed, we've included in this budget. And again, we've been very open and transparent about what those costs are, and we've shown them out into the forward estimates so that we know what the actual costs are going to be to the Territory, rather than trying to hide them and keep people in the dark and gaslight them about what the budget position is. So being very open and transparent about that. We're funding what needs to be funded to provide for Territorians, and the transparency is that we're showing at the end of the outer years and showing what the real state of delivering those services for Territorians is.
Thank you, Treasurer. Just sort of following on from that, we obviously, when you speak to people in the community, they want to see our debt reduce, but obviously costs are going up and they're going through the roof for a lot of things. We've spoken already around agencies having to find savings of about $20 million a year, and we've also talked about the debt ceiling being removed. I'm just wondering, have there been any measures put in place in this budget to make sure that we're being sort of long-term sustainability to ensure that we don't repeat those challenges that we've got and we do slowly reduce debt despite ongoing cost increases?
Yeah, thank you, Member for Fanny Bay. And I spoke earlier about our fiscal strategy and what that looks like going forward. So there are some key measurables for the Territory in the changes to our fiscal strategy. And as I said, the previous government had 16, and they were very, some of them were in place that they were put there. They were very, very easy to attain, so that they showed that there was obviously some progress and possibly some good news. We've been very realistic about what those targets are. So we're measuring ourselves against other states and territories. And where we want to be on those measurables is we want to be at least above the average, and that being in population growth, so in dwelling growth, in our cross-state product, state final demand. Those are the sorts of things that we want to be above the average. And the way that we're going to do that is in a couple of ways. So, of course, growing our economy is one piece. We know that I think it's 71% of our budget comes from the Commonwealth, whether it's in tied or untied funding through grants and GST. We're going to continue to work with the federal government on what our proportion of GST looks like, but the best way that we can improve our economy is to grow our own source revenue, and that's through engagement with business, engagement with proponents, and growing our own piece of the pie. So there's a number of ways to do that. Regulatory reform is one thing, and improved productivity is another. So that's why in the public sector we're focused on frontline services. The frontline services are out there that are the people that are working with business, industry and the public to deliver for the territory and for our Territorians. So there's a huge focus there. We need to address crime and antisocial behaviour, whether we like it or not. There is an actual cost to crime. And I suppose if you look at this budget, we're putting $1.5 billion into effectively crime and antisocial behaviour. So that's an actual cost. But the Australian Institute of Criminology have a formula where they then look at the larger parts of what crime is and what it contributes to an economy. And based on their numbers, and these are probably at the lower end, that comes in at about another $650 million. Okay, so when you look at what we're paying in that justice area for crime, that $1.5, $1.6 billion investment, add another $600 million onto that. So the cost of crime is, I suppose, $2.2 billion. If we can reduce that crime number through a number of methods, then we can reduce that cost. So that's money that we could spend elsewhere. Crime and antisocial behaviour are having an effect on our economy because it's about business investment and business confidence. We know that. So we need to turn that narrative around so that people see the Territory as a place to invest, a place to come and live, and a place to give a go. So whilst we're addressing the crime stuff over here, the productivity stuff, again, is key, and business investment is key. And I think for those who are at the Darwin Major Business Group's presentation, the economists that they had there said the private sector will be the way that the Territory can grow itself out of its debt to increase our own source revenue, so we're not as reliant on the federal government. So there's without labouring on it, the Fast Track Approvals Task Force is one piece to change that regulatory framework, because even the federal government know that unless there's changes to the regulatory framework, we will not improve productivity, and that's been in the news the last couple of days. And the Territory Coordinator is another piece of that as well, to go out and find that investment and drive that investment here into the Territory. And we need to play to our strengths, and those strengths are, of course, the resource sector, mining and energy, tourism, agriculture, horticulture and defence. They are the 5 key things that are going to drive our economy forward. So as a government, we're focused on making sure that we're delivering in that space to change that regulatory framework so that we can attract proponents to the Territory, so that we can increase our own source revenue, so we're not as reliant on the federal government, and we can start to work paying down that debt. We need that revenue so that we need to borrow less, and of course start reducing that debt burden on Territorians. And this is the first step. We have a long way to go. I'd love to say that we can I'd love to be able to wipe the debt out next week or next budget or by the end of this term of government, but the reality is that we can't. But we can start the work now to put that regulatory framework and those processes in place, so we can start to work on that piece to reduce that debt, reduce those borrowings, so that we have more discretion over the funds that we receive from the Commonwealth, but also our own funds that we receive through our own source revenue, to do those nice to do things here in the Territory. Because until we can do that, we're always going to struggle delivering just the basic services, and we want to be able to do more.
Thank you, Treasurer. We've got a bank up of questions, so I'll just give it in order that people have notified me. So we'll go Member for Johnston, Member for Karama, Member for 𝙍𝙀𝙇𝙬𝙎𝙎, and welcome, Member for 𝙍𝙀𝙍𝙬𝙎.
Thank you. I thought I'd come fishing.
All right, Member for Johnston.
Thank you, Chair. This is actually a question from the member for Mooka. And you just made reference to this, Treasurer. But the question is, in the Treasurer's budget speech, the Treasurer stated that $1.5 billion has been invested into public order and safety. Specifically mentioned is 500 beds for prisons, and we know that there has been increased infrastructure for prisons and increased staffing. Is it the job of Treasury to work out how this enormous investment is paid for? Where has this funding come from? And what are the most significant cuts across government spending for this proposed budget?
Thank you. And I acknowledge the question from the member for Mulca. There was some money came from internally from within the corrections budget, and there was an additional $170 million provided to corrections to deal with rising prison numbers and their infrastructure needs. There was no cuts to any other agencies to deliver this. This is additional money put into the justice system within that $1.5 billion in social order and justice. So the additional 500 beds are funded from that money, from that $170 million, and from the existing corrections budget, and delivered in conjunction with the Department of Logistics, Infrastructure and Corrections. So that's where that money has come from. There was no cuts to any other agencies to deliver on that.
Thank you.
Member for Karama.
Thank you. Treasurer, first of all, congratulations on bringing down the CLP government's first budget. And I've got budget paper 3 here, which I'll refer to. Obviously, you've had to make some hard decisions, including areas for savings and expenditure priorities. Appreciate that.
Cuts.
And it probably comes as no surprise that there's close attention being paid by the media, the public and MLAs as to who are the winners and losers in this budget. And that's fair enough, I guess. But as I said, if I can refer you to budget paper 3, page 161, Department of Housing, Local Government and Community Development. I think we can all agree that the provision of housing is an important component of our economy and for the growth of the Territory going forward. Now, I am aware that the opposition and the crossbenchers have been claiming that the housing budget has been slashed by over $100 million, and they're probably looking at the headline figures here in this BP paper, where it says for housing in 2024-2025 it was roughly $807 million, and in the 25-26 million budget it's listed as about $704 million, so a reduction of about $103 million. So you can understand where that figure may have come from. But Treasurer, what I want to know, is this true? Because I actually looked down and there's a very detailed footnote 1, which explains the variations, and it also touches on things like timing of Commonwealth funding. So I just want to know, is this true, or have they, opposition and that, either just haven't read it, the variation statement, they've chosen to ignore it, or they just don't understand? I'm not too sure, but can you explain it, please?
Thank you, Member for Karama.
Could I just get some clarity about which output this is? Are we still on financial
I've got the floor. Member for Arafura, I was jumping in, so I understand where you're going. If we can just keep the questions to the Treasurer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Member for Karama, for the question. Yeah, and I know that myself and Minister Edgington received some questions about this in last parliamentary sittings. And yeah, it does. When you look at BP3 on the housing, the overall housing number, there is a reduction from 806 to 703 million. And footnote 1 gives an explanation of that. But I think I might pass down to Tiziana. I think she's very much across what the accounting standards are and what this means, because there are other parts within the budget where we see changes. And it's not specifically a reduction or a cut. It's how the allocations happen and how the accounting standards are applied.
Thank you, Treasurer. Tiziana Hucent, Executive Director of Finance. So each year, both agency and whole of government statements are affected by non-cash adjustments, and they're a requirement under accounting standards. So non-cash adjustments are really book entries to adjust for the value and volume changes of assets and liabilities across government that affect financial statements but don't involve any inflows or outflows of cash. And so typically each year, as part of the budget development process, the Department of Logistics and Infrastructure advise agencies of completed capital works items up until March and what they expect to complete up until the end of June, resulting from completion of capital works projects. The agency then gets that data and determines whether or not they capitalise those assets on their books. And so that when they capitalise those assets, that results in a non-cash adjustment affecting depreciation. So depreciation expense is the largest non-cash adjustment affecting agency books. And that really reflects an expense for the consumption of that asset over that useful life. And so what we saw in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Communities is there was about a $45 million one-off increase in depreciation expense in affecting 24-25, and that really resulted from an accounting policy change for the revised useful life of public housing dwellings. And so in 23-24, the Department of Treasury and Finance had issued a new Treasurer's direction on non-financial assets that required agencies to reassess the useful life of their assets. And so the Department of Housing, Local Government and Communities undertook that work with an independent valuer to reassess the useful life of public housing dwellings, and that saw a reduction in the estimated useful life of those assets. And so what we saw in this budget was basically a catch-up of depreciation expense to reduce that useful life. So, so annually going forward, it will be on, I suppose, adjusted through a straight line method for the asset base, but it required a one-off catch-up depreciation adjustment. The other large non-cash adjustment that we do see as a result of capital works cash assessments and data provided to agencies is asset write-offs. So as part of the information that the Department of Logistics and Infrastructure provides agencies is agencies are then, I suppose, required to assess the works and the expenditure to determine whether or not they capitalise or expense those costs. So not all costs that are undertaken are capitalisable under accounting standards, and the agencies have to go line by line and determine what gets capitalised and what gets expensed. And the Department of Housing, Local Government and Community Development budgeted for a non-cash adjustment relating to asset write-offs of about $76 million, also affecting the 24-25 year. And that really relates to costs as part of the development of remote housing that are not capitalisable. So either under accounting standards that it doesn't result in an asset that we can use or doesn't meet the threshold for capitalisation. So the 24-25 budget is really for that department affected by significant non-cash adjustments that resulted in one-off expenditure in that year and doesn't affect following years. So the agencies, obviously non-cash adjustments can only be adjusted in the budget when data is known and we can actually estimate those costs. And with that data that DLI does provide agencies, they can do that in the year, but they can't project that in the following years. So we often see these one-off non-cash adjustments affecting agency financial statements in the current year, but not in the forward years. So each year you might expect to see these non-cash adjustments, but they only affect the current year.
Great. So we take into account the non-cash adjustments and then we can see there's a steady flow going into forward years. Is that right?
Yes, correct. So if you look at the 24-25 budget and the output for the agency as well, there is actually not a decline. So if you looked at last year, they also had non-cash adjustments in year. And so it does actually reflect an increase in that output if you do remove those non-cash adjustments.
Right. Thank you very much. No further questions.
Member for 𝙍𝙀𝙇𝙀𝙑𝙀𝙍.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Just two questions. First one following on from the member for Karama. Treasurer, can you confirm then that there has been an overall increase in repairs and maintenance for urban and remote housing?
There's been, Member for 𝙍𝙀𝙍, thank you for the question. There's been an increase of $20 million in the repairs and maintenance budget
Yes.
for Department of Logistics and Infrastructure.
Right. And is that new money or is that existing?
That's new money and that's indexed ongoing. So that's on top of the pre-existing budget, an additional $20 million, and that's 3% indexed.
Right. And is that
forward.
borrowed funds or is that used from a Commonwealth grant?
No, that is borrowed money.
Borrowed money. Great, thank you. And then just output 1, I assume that's where we're still at, financial management?
Correct.
Yep. Just wanted to follow on. I understand that you spoke earlier about the 𝙍𝙀𝙇𝙀𝙬 program and the financial management. And Treasurer, I take note that you mentioned around the performance indicators that CEOs were to abide by. I'm just interested, given that your government is very interested in ensuring that there are consequences for everyone, what are the consequences for ministers whose agencies repeatedly breach their own financial management?
I'm not aware of any specific consequences for ministers. That might be a decision of the Chief Minister. The Chief Minister is effectively the boss of all the other ministers, but it's up to the ministers.
Thank you, that's all. So there'll be no consequences for ministers whose agencies continue to breach the financial management. That's effectively what you've said.
Member for 𝙍𝙬𝙍, please. So earlier this morning, we clarified we won't cut members off, and that goes the other way as well with questions. So, Treasurer.
Thank you. And as I was saying, ministers will be responsible then for their CEs and the CEs' performance and disciplinary measures within that framework of the CEs. While I'm speaking also, Mr Chair, I have an answer to a written question which I'm happy to table, and that was around the budget roadshow costs by location.
Ev, could you give do you know the question number? Oh, question 2.1. Treasurer.
I can read them out or I can table a document, Mr Chair, whatever's easiest for the committee.
Table.
Yeah, is it large, Treasurer?
It's not.
There's no need to you can table it through the chair, gives the members more questions, opportunity to ask questions, or unless you want to gag us.
Member for 𝙍𝙬𝙍, thank you. It's up to you, Treasurer.
It's not that long, Mr Chair. So,
Catherine, kill a bit of time,
venue hire for Catherine was $750. Catering was $669 for a total of $1,419. Tennant Creek venue hire, which included audio visual equipment, was $330. Catering was $552 for a total of $882. For Nhulunbuy venue hire, cost including audio visual was $175. Catering was $500 for a total of $675. So a total of those costs was $2,976. The events in Alice Springs were hosted by the Chamber of Commerce and Master Billers, so they were not costs incurred by government. The actual travel for the under-treasurer, airfares were $2,635.15. Accommodation was $740.60. CTM fees were $63.15. And Alice Springs event tickets were $55 for a total of $3,493.90. And the travel for myself and ministerial staff, and there was only one person, airfares were $4,525.83. Accommodations $1,088.67. And total vehicle hire, TA and CTM fees and other expenses was $2,771.39 for a total of $8,385.89.
Thank you, Treasurer. Member for 𝙍𝙬𝙍.
Thank you. So just again confirming, the Treasurer, you have said this morning that there is no real consequence for members or ministers whose agencies repeatedly breach, even when they replace their CEO. That would be potentially a decision for the Chief Minister or the Cabinet, correct?
That would be correct. And as the member for 𝙍𝙬𝙍 was a former minister, he would understand this as well.
Just asking, you're talking about your own 𝙍𝙀𝙇𝙀𝙍 program, so just wanted to get some clarification.
Happy with the answer, Member for
Happy
𝙍𝙬𝙍?
to move on to output 2.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Group 1.1? That concludes consideration of Output Group 1. The committee will now move on to Output Group 2, Economic Services, Output Group 2.1, Economic Services. Are there any questions? And we'll start with the opposition. No. Any other questions? That concludes consideration of output 2.1. The committee will now consider output 2.2, payments on behalf of government. Are there any questions?
Yep.
Member for 𝙍𝙀𝙍.
Thank you. Treasurer, in BP3, there is a funding increase for this output attributed to an increase in the community service obligation payments for retail electricity tariffs offset by a reduction in the Commonwealth funding for the National Energy Bill Relief Program. Can you please give us a breakdown of those two figures?
Yeah. Thank you, Member for 𝙍𝙍. I'll pass down to Jason Robertson, Executive Director, Economics.
Thank you. Yes, so there's been a substantial increase in the CSO funding requirements for 25-26, as you'll see in the budget papers. Primarily, that's driven by increases in the cost of supply into the electricity system, driven really through regulated decisions of the Australian Energy Regulator as it relates to power and water's network tariffs. Decisions that are expected, and there's a draft decision available from the Utilities Commission as it relates to system operator or system and market operator charges, and higher generation costs as well. So that's really driving the uniform tariff CSO increase. The Commonwealth, as would have been announced in the Commonwealth budget and has been confirmed since, they're extending their electricity retail bill relief for 6 months at a slightly different rate, but largely on the same terms and conditions as occurred in 24-25.
So the significant increase in the utility payments, the CSO payments, I'm just getting an understanding from 155 million in 24-25 to 192 million or thereabouts in 25-26, you're suggesting is driven by the national energy regulation prices and the demand on energy pressures?
So it's increasing in, I guess, the costs of supply. So for the large majority of Northern Territory customers, they're subject to regulated prices. And to the extent that the costs of supplying those customers increases faster than the increase in the charges that are provided, then government has to meet that cost and pay retailers the difference.
Yeah. So to be clear, that's the demand pressures or the supply pressures? So obviously government buys its energy. Is that the area that you're talking about, or is it attributed to both?
Well, so retailers purchase the energy on behalf of customers through generators and network charges, and the costs of those of generation charges and network costs have increased.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. And Treasurer, do you intend to continue the CSO payments to keep energy prices down for consumers?
Yes, we certainly will be. We will see an increase across the budget cycle in the CSO payments as the cost of generating power increases. So we're increasing the CSO payments to maintain tariffs in line with our policy. So yes, the CSO will continue, and the CSO will increase in the outer years.
Yeah, so just on that, obviously we're talking about energy. It is very difficult sometimes to look at the demand and the supply pressures, but in terms of that, what do the forward estimates look like in terms of the ongoing CSO commitments?
Just bear with us for a moment, Member for 𝙍𝙍. We do have the data. It's in BP2. I'll just hand over to Jason Robertson, Executive Director of Economics, who has the data there.
In recognition of the increased CSO costs over the forward estimates, government has provided an additional $255 million from 24-25 to 27-28 to support the regulated utility tariff subsidy, $103 million in 28-29, and a further $101 million ongoing, so beyond the forward estimates.
Great. So just to be clear, that where was the formula to develop that 250 million, I believe you said it was?
So as part of the budget process, we forecast future electricity charges and costs of supply, and provide that advice to government, and they make decisions around how much they choose to fund the forward estimates.
Okay. So, Treasurer, this position around the CSO payments, what impact does that have, or will that policy have in the future, if any, on power prices?
Well, the ongoing CSO maintains power prices at current levels, and they are adjusted by CPI every year, which is around, we've capped that at 3%.
3%, yep.
So the CSO works alongside those tariffs to maintain, I suppose, the per kilowatt, cents per kilowatt hour costs within, that increase of 3% ongoing.
So if there's an increase in CPI, that could potentially have an increase on power prices under this policy.
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
So I'm just bearing in mind you've spoken that it's been factored in in line with CPI, which is 3%. And if CPI continues to grow, that would then need to be a matter for government to consider additional financial support. Otherwise, power prices would increase.
There are CPI numbers in the budget papers, so we're expecting CPI to remain around between anywhere, and again, they're forecasts, so they're not exactly definitive. We're expecting the CPI figures to remain between that 2.5 and 3% into the outer years. If there was any change to that CPI figure, and if it increased above that 3%, like significantly above that 3%, then government, yes, through the budgetary process, would have to come back and review what the CSO looked like.
And the formula of $250 million is based on CPI staying at 3% each year. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a combination of things there, Member for 𝙍𝙬𝙎. So not only is just the CPI, but it's also what government decides to maintain the regulated tariff at. So I think the current tariff is around 31 point something cents per kilowatt hour. I think here we are. Where are we? Yeah, so 32.63 cents per kilowatt hour currently for 25-26. So what are we? We're the fifth cheapest power in the country. So as I said, if there was changes, the tariff rate is determined by government. But as I said, there's if CPI changes and affects that, then it would be a decision of government what that tariff rate would look like. But the CSO is there to maintain that tariff rate.
That's all.
Any other questions on Output 2.2? That concludes consideration of Output 2.2 and Output Group 2. I now call for questions relating to Output Group 3, Territory Revenue, Output 3.1, Territory Revenue. Are there any questions? Member for 𝙍𝙬𝙎𝙏.
Thank you. Look, my question, Treasurer, is can you confirm how you're reprioritising the $60 million that was allocated for underground power projects in the northern suburbs of Darwin that was funded in the wake of Cyclone Marcus?
I'm not sure whether that sits in this.
Well, it is. It's on BP Output 3 on page 100, listed as a footnote.
Thank you. Yes, the $60 million are from the undergrounding of power, which, mind you, well, only done a little bit, has been reprioritised and used to fund the homeowner grants. And yeah, and the balance is used as savings.
So it's been used for the homeowner grants and gone into general revenue for other areas of saving. Oh, okay.
That's correct.
And there's no future project now in terms of undergrounding power?
Well,
in terms of Treasury's consideration of budget allocations?
Well, that would sit in a couple of areas, Member for 𝙍𝙀𝙇𝙬𝙎. That would sit, of course, with Power and Water Corporation. After the decision was made to remove that $60 million, which would have only done a very small portion, actually went to Power and Water and to find out the true cost of undergrounding power in the northern suburbs, and it was in excess of $500 million. So if that were to take place, and would have to be planned and staged, and that's $500 million in today's dollars, that project would take a considerable period of time. So if Power and Water were to consider doing that, then there would have to be some very, very significant planning about how that may take place, and then some very significant decisions around what that budget might look like to be able to deliver a project of that scope and magnitude.
Great. So just to confirm from your response that in terms of the work that Treasury is doing, there is no work around understanding what the costs might be to underground power throughout the northern suburbs of Darwin.
That's not something that Treasury are working on. That is something that you're probably best off to ask the Power and Water Corporation and Governor on, I think, the following Thursday.
Do you have further questions, Member for 𝙍𝙬𝙬𝙬? Are there any other questions on output 3.1? Member for Nightcliff.
Thank you, Chair. I think this is the right output. I just have some questions around the revenue from the gas industry. So it's been challenging to get a clear answer from this government on how much money the NT actually receives from the gas industry. All the figures in the budget papers tend to lump mining and gas revenue together, and it's important that these figures are broken down so the public can understand the contribution of the industry. So why are these figures not reported on separately, and can you please tell me how much the NT receives per year from the gas industry alone in revenue?
Thank you, Member for Nightcliff, for the question. I will pass to Deputy Under Treasurer, who has a brief on revenue. Of course, we can't identify any of those sources, but we are receiving, if we're talking gas, we are receiving revenue from Central Australia because they are actually in production at the moment. No one else has come into production as yet.
Mick Butler, Deputy Under Treasurer. Yeah, so the reason that gas royalties are incorporated in the overall statement of mineral royalties is because under our mineral royalty legislation, like our taxation legislation, we are not to identify the tax affairs of individuals. And because there is only one entity currently paying gas royalties, were we to put that as a line item in the budget, it would identify their taxation affairs. At the time when we have more than one producer, and the number can be published such that it doesn't identify the individual's payments, we would be able to de-aggregate it and show gas royalties as a separate line item.
Okay. So we heard in the March sittings from the Minister for Mining that the revenue from the gas industry was $8 million. Are you able to confirm if that's correct?
I'm subject to those obligations in terms of our taxation legislation. If that minister gave a number, then he was presumably giving it from industry that information that industry had provided to him, not that we had acquired through our compulsory legislation in terms of the tax.
Okay. So currently, as it stands, there's no way to get an answer from these figures of just the revenue from the gas industry.
Yeah, we can't publish them.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. So just to still speak broadly about this revenue, though, I'm going to go off the 8 million figure that we heard from the Minister for Mining. And if my math is correct, that's about 0.09% of the Territory's total revenue. What is the rationale for investing hundreds of millions of taxpayers' money into the gas industry for that sort of revenue?
I think The revenue currently, as we've said, is from one specific or one supplier in the territory. We know from exploration and data that we've received that there is the opportunity for more gas production, onshore gas production within the territory. What those numbers range anywhere from hundreds of million, or like 100 million to like $400 million in revenue, but of course that can't be realised until production takes place and whether or not those entities go into full production. And I don't know what those numbers are. We don't know what those numbers are, but we know that there is the opportunity for significant onshore gas production within the Northern Territory. And as part of our revenue stream moving forward, we are in support of the gas industry because we understand, based on the exploration data to date and some of the initial flow rates from some of the exploration and from other proponents, and I think some of these numbers come out of the Pepper inquiry as well. I know there was discussion around what the volumes are within the Beetaloo sub-basin. There is the opportunity for large-scale production from onshore gas. And from that large-scale production of onshore gas, then there's the opportunity for certainly increased revenues to the territory long-term. So that is the reason that there is support for the onshore gas industry from this government. There was support from the previous government as well, and we will continue to support that industry as it grows.
And you mentioned the fracking inquiry and that modelling. So they did do modelling, you're right, looked at the flows. It was ACL Allen Consultancy that did the modelling for the previous Northern Territory government on the potential revenue from onshore gas industry. The modelling in the most optimistic scenario, like high output, thousands of gas wells, they demonstrated that average royalties would be about 68 million per year in the most optimistic scenario, which they said was unlikely. So this is less than 1% of the NT government's total revenue. And even with that model revenue from payroll tax and derived GST from fracking added, it would be around less than 2% of the territory's budget. So that figure will not even cover the amount that your government is spending on paying for things for the gas industry. Like in this budget, we've seen, I think, 180 million on building roads. For the, excuse me?
Well, she's asking it
sorry.
if you listen.
Okay, committee. Member for Nightcliff.
Truth hurts.
So
Member for 𝙍𝙬𝙍𝙎𝙏.
in this, the question that I'm asking is that in this budget we've seen, for example, 180 million on building roads for the gas industry. So we're paying more in tax handouts and building infrastructure for the gas industry than we'd potentially be getting in royalties at 68 million.
Thank you, Member for Nightcliff, for the question. And of course, the roads that we're talking about in the budget also support the regions too. So the roads we're talking about are roads to Borroloola. It just so happens that the Beetaloo sub-basin is along that road to Borroloola. So yes, that road does assist the gas industry, but it also supports the communities out there in that region as well. And there's others in different areas. We're supporting beef roads, other roads within the Barclay Electric, which supports the Amaru Phosphate project, but also those roads support communities because they are already existing. So not the investment in those roads, yes, it helps the gas industry, but it also helps the communities out in an area. Now, I'm not sure if those revenue figures of $68 million are particularly accurate.
Because if government modelling.
Well, I said it's modelling. I said we're seeing different things, I suppose, on those flow rates. But also the government is also investing into this industry because it's not just about what's going to specifically the royalty revenue coming out of those wellheads, but it's also the larger picture investment into the territory. Now, yes, there may be a FIFO workforce. We're hoping that there's not going to be, and we're certainly, I know that the proponents that I've spoken to want to see a local workforce because it actually works better for them rather than a FIFO workforce. But then it's all the ancillary industries and businesses that will support that gas industry going forward. So you would certainly see an increase in Borroloola, for instance, being one of the closest communities to some of those Beetaloo sub-basin wells. There's the opportunity for those businesses in Borroloola to pick up additional work and new businesses start. Same here in Darwin. There's also the opportunity for Tennant Creek becoming a hub in some respects to support 𝙍𝙬𝙬𝙍𝙬, but also other mining and resource industries in that area. So, yes, there's investment from the Northern Territory government into roads and other aspects, but it also, we're talking about the broader spectrum. So it's not just about the business or the proponent drilling the hole, putting in the well and taking the gas out from the basin, but it's also all those businesses and communities that then support that larger economic development.
Yeah, but I guess with that figure being the most recent and accurate up-to-date thing, from government reporting, can you justify the amount of expenditure to hundreds of millions in taxpayer funds for a $68 million at best revenue?
I'll hand over to Mick Butler, the Deputy Under-Treasurer, because he has some more data on this point.
So just to make the point that the 𝙍𝙬𝙬𝙬 Allen modelling was undertaken at a time of different prices in gas, but also under the former petroleum royalties regime, which allowed for a higher level of deductions than we currently allow under our new Petroleum Royalty Act. So just while that was an estimate at the times of a particular level of production, it was taken at a particular time at a particular level of gas prices with a royalty regime that would not have raised the same amount of royalties. So even taking all those other factors into consideration, that the royalty outcome would be a lot higher under that same scenario where it modelled today.
So can you give us what's the figure then if you know it's higher?
We haven't replicated the 𝙍𝙬𝙬𝙬 modelling, but it is an outcome that's dependent on a level of investment in the 𝙍𝙬𝙬 and including whether or not you get a connection to the East Coast and can export gas. So there's a range of scenarios. I would just make the point that the 𝙍𝙬𝙬𝙬 model is no longer up to date or contemporaneous.
Okay. Are you going to look at doing more modelling then to give us a more up-to-date figure?
We haven't considered any additional modelling at this stage. As I said, the proponents are out there now doing their test wells and looking at their flow rates. I think once we see some more data on what those flow rates look like, I think we'd then be able to probably get to a point in time where we may have a better picture of what I suppose those flow rates look like and then what that revenue rate will be to the Territory. But again, that's based on demand as well. So demand for gas is high. We know we're seeing an energy shortage on the East Coast, and there's a push towards increasing gas. Places on the East Coast and the southern states are actually building LNG import terminals to import LNG to produce power. Now,
because we export most of our gas.
So
that's the issue.
If the proponents in the 𝙍𝙬𝙬𝙬 are able to improve and increase pipelines and connectivity to the east and southern states, then the demand is there, and so then of course production will go up based on that demand, and with an increase in production, which will then equate to an increase in revenue to the Territory. So there's a couple of things that need to happen. I know the proponents are looking at that. They're also looking to bring gas here to Darwin and utilise the facilities we have here to, of course, the Territory will benefit from that gas for power production, but then there's also the ability then for that to be processed and be sent offshore for them as well. So,
thank you, Treasurer. I do want to at least put on the record that part of the reason we export most of our gas. There's any ideas of a shortage or anything like that in Australia is just unequivocally not true. We export most of it. So there is a figure that I've seen thrown around a lot, that the NT motorists pay 32 times more in vehicle registration than the gas industry in the Northern Territory pays in royalties in the NT. Is it true that INPEX and Darwin LNG had never paid any royalties?
Well, I think I may have answered this in Parliament as well. INPEX and Santos, the gas is offshore, all right? So it's not in our sovereign waters, it's not onshore, it's not in the Northern Territory. So any royalties from Santos or INPEX go to the federal government, go to the Commonwealth. So we don't see those. Where we see benefit from those two proponents is what they pay in payroll tax, of course. That's a benefit and an income in revenue to the Northern Territory, but also then the employment and everything else that they utilise within Darwin specifically as far as business goes, and they drive investment within Darwin. So whilst we don't see specific royalties from Santos or INPEX, that goes to the Commonwealth.
And the Commonwealth doesn't actually take any royalties from them, so they take our gas for free, essentially. But I understand that it's federal. I just wanted to, that when we talk about this gas industry that we have and the benefits, that we don't get any royalties from that. Thank you for confirming that.
Are there any other questions on output 3.1? That concludes consideration of output 3.1. We will now consider output 3.2, homeowner assistance. Are there any questions?
Homeowner assistance. I thought that was 3.1.
3.1 was territory revenue.
Yeah.
So 3.2, homeowner assistance. That concludes consideration of output 3.2 and output group 3. The committee will now proceed to output group 4, superannuation. Output 4.1, superannuation. Are there any questions? No questions? That concludes the consideration of output group 4. The committee will now call for questions on output group 5, economic regulation. Output 5.1, utilities commission. Are there any questions? There's no questions. That concludes consideration of output group 5. The committee will now consider output group 6, corporate and shared services. Output 6.1, corporate and governance. Are there any questions? There's no questions. That concludes consideration of output 6.1. The committee will now move on to output 6.2, shared services received. Are there any questions? That concludes the consideration of output 6.2 and output group 6. That concludes consideration of outputs relating to the Department of Treasury and Finance. The committee will now move on to consider the Central Holding Authority. I thank you for your time. Treasurer? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It will be the same people here to consider output group 7, the Central Holding Authority.
Thank you. The committee will now consider the income and expenses of Central Holding Authority. Are there any questions? That concludes consideration of the Central Holding Authority. The committee will now proceed to the Northern Territory Treasury Corporation business line. Northern Territory Treasury Corporation.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and it will be the same officials for the Northern Territory Treasury Corporation.
The committee will now consider the income and expenses of the NT Treasury Corporation. Are there any questions? That concludes consideration of this business line. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank departmental officers who provided advice to the Treasurer today. The committee will now move on to consider outputs relating to the Department of Logistics and Infrastructure. I now thank you for your time today. Treasurer, if you have any, over to you.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I'd like to thank the officials here from Department of Treasury and Finance. I would like to thank them for all their work leading into and developing the 2025-2026 Northern Territory budget, and for all the preparation and work they've put into estimates. So a very, very dedicated and certainly very experienced and knowledgeable team. I thank everybody for their work in preparation for today.
Thank you.
We'll now just break very shortly while the staff transition.